Donkey Kong Country is a platformer developed by Rare and released on the Super Nintendo during the holiday season of 1994. Despite heavy competition from Sega in the form of Sonic & Knuckles, in addition to the Sega 32X add-on, Donkey Kong Country ended up shifting the tides of the 16-bit console war back in Nintendo's favor, selling over 9 million cartridges worldwide. In addition to the massive sales figures eclipsing everything but the Mario franchise on the system, Donkey Kong Country was a media darling, earning universal critical acclaim. Game Fan magazine gave the game a perfect score of 100 out of 100, stating, "Absolute 16-bit perfection. It just does not get any better." GamePro magazine scored the game a perfect 5 out of 5, noting, "If you want to hit an 8-ball in the side pocket, you'll recognize DKC for what it is, the gorilla of your dreams." Finally, Electronic Gaming Monthly gave the game a 9.2 out of 10, proclaiming, "Is this really the Super NES I'm playing? Donkey Kong Country is simply mind-blowing." The accolades didn't stop in 1994, though. In a 2007 review, IGN scored the Virtual Console release an 8.5 out of 10, stating, "It's revolutionary in 1994. Visuals aren't as spectacular anymore now in 2007, but DKC gameplay is still a lot of fun, and it's still easy to see why this was the game that saved the Super." Donkey Kong Country has fared well in the YouTube era too. In a 2018 video, the completionist declared, "I had a ton of fun replaying this masterpiece." Needless to say, over the past 24 years, Donkey Kong Country has remained a well-received and beloved game. But of course, one must wonder if DKC is still a masterpiece, or is Donkey Kong Country best viewed through the lens of nostalgia? Well, there is only one way to find out, so let's dive in. Donkey Kong Country is light on story. Basically, Kong's banana hoard has been stolen by the dastardly King K. Rool, and Donkey Kong wants his banana stash back. Thankfully, Donkey Kong has a very particular set of skills he has acquired over a very long career, namely jumping and rolling. Donkey Kong's standard moveset feels right at home for a 1994 platformer. He can walk, run, jump, and can roll into enemies. Even better, he has a sidekick, Diddy Kong. Diddy's moves are identical, but there are subtleties between the two protagonists. There are certain enemies only the big guy can jump on, but Diddy Kong is a little faster, I think, and has a slightly higher jump. I've also heard Diddy Kong can roll for longer, but I never personally noticed this during gameplay. This is probably because I didn't utilize the roll feature as much as I could have. Coming from a long history of jumping on enemies to take them down, this was my main method for taking down a majority of the enemies here. That isn't to say the roll isn't effective, because it absolutely is. I enjoyed rolling to have jumping enemies land on a rolling Kong. It can even be stacked, increasing the speed of a rolling Kong, which is useful for speedrunning. More important, it's a critical element in platforming. The Kongs can roll off an edge and then jump afterwards. This is helpful for nabbing items or just extending the distance of a jump. Even better, everything feels very tight and responsive. Other than switching characters, Donkey Kong Country is a 2-button game, with one button jumping and the other used for rolling and then running. I should note Donkey Kong can also slam his fists into the ground, which can be used for attacking, but I never utilized it. But back to the field, inputs are recognized immediately without having to wait for animation frames to complete. Mid-air control is also perfect, allowing just enough tweaking to land on small platforms, yet also retain momentum for the next jump. Honestly, Donkey Kong Country is a terrific feeling game, and I have no quibbles to speak of. In addition to the two main characters, there are a number of animal buddies one can find and utilize too. Rambi the rhinoceros can smash through enemies, as well as break through walls, revealing bonus rooms. On guard, the swordfish is utilized in water levels, offering better agility and an attack. Winky the frog has exceptional leaping abilities and can dispatch spiky enemies. Espresso the ostrich can walk over small enemies, has a double jump, and can glide. Finally, Squawks the parrot carries a lamp in one level. Besides Squawks the parrot, which seems to serve no purpose other than to show off the hardware effects, each animal buddy is optional optional and provides a de facto hit point. You see, there is no life bar in Donkey Kong Country. While running solo, Diddy and Donkey will die in a single hit. After securing the other Kong, which will tail the playable character, receiving damage will cause said Kong to run off the screen, and the second character will become the playable one. Once another DK barrel is located and smashed, they rejoin the action. In this regard, a player may find themselves playing more carefree when they have two Kongs, and far more cautious with one. In many respects, it's a nice way to have a life bar without cluttering up the screen with the HUD. The player always knows exactly how many times they can take a hit without a number symbol representing it. Another thing I like is how the animals are optional for the main quest of the game. Besides squawks, which one cannot get rid of, these aren't required for progression. Rather, they generally make gameplay easier. Rambi's power, Winky's excellent jumping, and On-Guard's superior swimming all make the gameplay smoother. A player will want to take care to not take a hit and risk losing them. It's a nice little risk versus reward element, which I find adds depth to the gameplay. Moving along, let's get to the items. First and foremost are barrels. The important ones have a DK logo on them, signifying the other Kong is inside. Plain barrels can be used as projectiles against enemies or used to smash through rocks to reveal bonus rooms. TNT barrels pack an even greater punch, while steel kegs are cooler still and will roll through multiple enemies and can even be ridden. Moving beyond the barrels are more traditional collectible items. Nabbing 100 bananas will reward an extra life, as well as nabbing a balloon. Each stage also has Kong letters, and finding all 4 on a stage will yield an extra life. Next are animal tokens, and finding 3 of the same critter will warp the player to a bonus stage where collecting smaller animal tokens on a timed run will reward even more extra lives. While I did find myself getting quite a few game overs on my first playthrough, I ended my 5th playthrough with a whopping 33. If I were to give one piece of advice to first-time players, it would be to grab every item seen, because one will need all of the lives they can get. Like the moveset, Donkey Kong Country follows a traditional game structure. Stages are grouped into worlds and unlock sequentially. Each world concludes with a boss fight before the next becomes accessible. Standard stuff. One can also revisit previous areas to farm for lives if they so choose. However, there is no way to get back to the main map and choose a different world until arriving at each area's Funky Kong. Each of the worlds in Donkey Kong Country break up the game and act as progression from Donkey Kong's home to King K. Rool's ship. Congo Jungle features the now iconic DK settings, from lush jungles to caves and even an underwater area. The Monkey Mines introduce the famous minecart stages and a nifty stop-and-go station where touching a stop-and-go barrel will cause rock cracks to stop moving. Vine Valley introduces a cool treetop set piece as well as a temple area. Gorilla Glacier has the obligatory ice and snow levels, complete with slippery mechanics. Creme Croc Industries Incorporated adds new industrial set pieces, including a factory area and a stage where one will have to ride along a platform while avoiding obstacles. The final world, Chimp Caverns, doesn't offer any new set pieces, but does feature more challenging versions of things experienced thus far. While DKC may not have the most diverse lineup of stages ever created, everything feels logical, like these places could exist on a cartoon island inhabited by anthropomorphic apes. What isn't traditional are the graphics. As everyone knows, the team at Rare utilized high-end silicon graphics workstations to render highly detailed 3D models and then digitized them as sprites for use on the low-end machine. Whether this technique has aged well is certainly up for debate, but I'm also not going to criticize an artist for their choice of tools. I will say there appears to be an abundant amount of colors on the screen, so much so there is virtually no dithering, helping this look like a step up above what was possible on competing hardware. I also appreciate how there are oftentimes a few scrolling layers in the background rather than one, and it does help foreground elements stand out from the background and further sell the 3D effect. I also like the palette swapping and other color changing effects. These are used to simulate lightning in Ropey Revenge, giving a brief glimpse of vibrance during the lightning strikes. It will also cause the mines to drip with red after touching a stop-and-go barrel. The sun sets in the beginning of Orangutan Gang, causing the whole screen to get dimmer in real time. Saturation is lost in Snow Barrel Blast as the snowstorm increases with intensity. Transparency is also a common element, making water opaque, adding mist in the mines, and even some basic lighting effects, again helping push Donkey Kong Country past its main competition. I should also note there is very little slowdown. It is most common during the bonus stages, but rarely happens during the regular stages. From a technical standpoint, DKC is a tour de force for the 16-bit era, featuring a high color count and plenty of graphical effects to send the 4th generation off on a high note. From an artistic standpoint, the graphics can be hit or miss. For example, I do find the heroes are animated well. Walking, running, lifting, and jumping animations all look excellent and smooth with plenty of animation frames. It's clear the artists had a firm understanding of 3D modeling and were able to make Diddy and Donkey Kong look awesome. However, enemy animations aren't at the same level. Jumping enemies always stood out for me, with critters leaping in the air without the appropriate leg motions. It's a small quibble for sure, but a good example of the inconsistent quality. Fish and sharks, on the other hand, look great. I also find the game sometimes lacks contrast. Again, this is not consistent. The jungle stages look good, with the sky, leaves, and walking paths standing out against the rocks and tree trunks, giving the player a great visual cue as to what is a platform and what isn't. Same goes for the underwater areas, with a great color contrast between the background and foreground. Other stages are more muted, either lacking color variation or many objects being a similar brightness, making it difficult to comprehend the structures of the level. Additionally, sometimes the pre-rendered art contains more detail than what the limited resolution of the Super Nintendo can display, resulting in very pixelated graphics. When the sprites are large and chunky, the art looks really good, but other times, not so much. Another defining feature is the soundtrack. Instead of just rehashing what everyone has been saying for the past 20 years, I would just summarize and say I agree with the consensus. Some of the melodies are seriously catchy. The instrument selection is terrific, offering a number of sounds I have never heard the Super Nintendo make, with rich-sounding wind and horned instruments. Each environment has a unique vibe, from 80s synth to jungle swing and everything in between. While some are more memorable than others, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as at no time during my 24 hours did I ever get tired of hearing any of them. The sound effects, on the other hand, are more hit or miss. I really dig the muffled ape sounds when the player comes across a DK barrel. The quality is excellent and is a great audio cue to their presence. Bees buzz, birds chirp, the Kongs make a great thunk when landing on the ground. It's all very well done and adds to the overall richness of the experience, but not everything is perfect. The slippas sound like static rather than snakes, and the claptraps make an obnoxious biting sound like somebody eating too loud. These moments aren't too frequent, but stand in stark contrast to what is an otherwise terrific audio presentation. Of course, simple controls, solid game structure, unique visuals, and terrific audio alone aren't enough to make Donkey Kong Country a masterpiece, so I'd like to dive deeper into the actual design of the game. But first, I should mention I am playing the Japanese version of the game. I bought the Super Famicom versions of the trilogy because they are half the price. This means the title screen shows Super Donkey Kong rather than Donkey Kong Country, and most of the text is in Japanese. I initially thought this would mean I would only be losing out on the hint system provided by Cranky Kong to find secrets, but it turns out there are more differences between the Western release and Japanese release than I initially thought. Some enemies were removed from this release, and extra bananas, DK barrels, and 1-up balloons were added or swapped in. In fact, there are a couple dozen tweaks made to the Japanese release. According to game designer Greg Males, Nintendo requested the game be made easier for the Japanese release, which resulted in the changes. This means my personal experience with this title is based off an easier build of the game. Anyway, despite the decreased difficulty, I still found Donkey Kong Country to be a maddeningly difficult game on my first playthrough. First, most deaths will be a result of falling into pits rather than tricky enemy patterns. Donkey Kong Country has a fetish for bottomless pits. This means a life bar isn't necessary, but it does mean newcomers are likely to experience a ton of instant deaths for failing to perform a jump correctly. While not recorded, I found myself sliding off of tires, slipping off ledges in the snow areas, and finally messing up sections with barrels. That is another thing in abundance: barrels. The player is often tasked with launching themselves from barrels that are either rotating or sliding about the stage, with a well-timed button press necessary for progress. While there is nothing inherently wrong with the mechanic, and I can honestly say I experienced no input lag whatsoever, I can't help but wish this was introduced in a way where a player could fail a few times without being punished so heavily. It takes some time to get a feel for the rotation, timing, and flow of the barrels, and first-time players will quickly drain their life stock learning the ropes. Next, the collision is a little janky. Even on this recorded run, things would still catch me by surprise, either missing a collectible or not damaging an enemy when I expected. On the flip side, the collision is often very forgiving, allowing the player to damage an enemy even if they are just slightly above them. Still, new players are still likely to get bit by an unpredictable collision box. However, the worst offense is the trial and error. I found the underwater areas most problematic, specifically the croctopus. These things will chase the player, forcing them to swim as quickly as they can through tight corridors with little room for error. If a player hasn't memorized the corridor or gotten a handle on the general flow of these sections, the croctopus will surely catch them, causing damage or death. Same goes for the squidge. I can't tell you how many times I was surprised by one of these things. As the Kongs are dead center on the screen, and the squidges can appear from anywhere, it's all too easy to swim into one of these things. And that is because the swimming mechanics are straight out of 1985, meaning the jump button is used to swim. Changing directions is slow, and it is nearly impossible to get out of the way of enemies in time. On subsequent playthroughs, I knew to just take these areas exceptionally slow, something a first-time player wouldn't know, though fast-moving chomps would still catch me by surprise. The surprise element is present in the minecart stages as well. Much like the chomps, obstacles will actively move towards the player as the player moves forward, and with the limited 256 pixel wide resolution, enemies often appear in the blink of an eye. Sometimes barrels are placed strategically, communicating to the player to jump, but other times it's just a game of trial and error until a player memorizes everything. Finally, I should also mention the final level, Platform Perils. This level features enemies which are immune to melee attacks and have to be taken down with a barrel throw. Unfortunately, the stage is also filled with temporary moving platforms, forcing the player to make split-second decisions to perform the 1-2 combo of throwing a barrel in the right direction and then jumping before a platform vanishes. This level tormented me on my first playthrough, and I found it quite frustrating. Now, many of my favorite 16-bit platformers feature similar trial and error gameplay, such as Aladdin by Virgin Games, Toy Story by Traveler's Tales, and of course, even the Sonic games. So what is the point of bringing all of this up? Well, the point is, I don't think Donkey Kong Country is designed any better than many classic 16-bit platformers, which generally contained a healthy dose of trial and error to increase the difficulty and playtime or increase rental sales. And like many of these games, unless one grew up playing this over and over, memorizing all of the little quirks, Donkey Kong Country isn't exactly friendly to first-time players, even if they are veterans of the genre. This is compounded somewhat by the save system. One can only save at Candy's save point, and one cannot exit a world and visit a save point from an earlier world until they reach Funky Kong. This means for many worlds, a few levels will have to be played before a save can be accessed. For first-time players, this becomes excruciating in World 4, Gorilla Glacier. A whopping 5 stages must be cleared before a save point is reached, and for my money, these are some of the toughest stages found in the entire game. Snow Barrel Blast, Slip Slide Ride, and Croctopus Chase all cost me many game overs, and it sucked the fun out of the game to have to restart the world over and over again with progress unsaved. I don't recall any of the other worlds causing such anguish languish either, with a gentler difficulty curve to a save point. On the flip side, I was thankful there was a save system at all, because some of those others I mentioned have limited continues and no saving whatsoever, so it has that going for it. Now, while I don't find the game to be better designed than the upper echelon of 16-bit platformers, I don't find it worse either. As critical as I have been, I do find Donkey Kong Country to be pretty great. For me, it all boils down to the platforming. For whatever reason, I just really like jumping in video games, and Donkey Kong Country is one of the best in this regards. While holding the run button, both characters can jump a lengthy distance, and platforms always seem spaced to allow a player to keep moving forward even if inputs are not perfect. And like I said, the game is very friendly and predictable with mid-air adjustments, allowing players to land on tiny platforms with ease. The controls are loose enough to allow flexibility, but tight enough to prevent things from being slippery. It's just perfect. And ultimately, this is where Donkey Kong Country grabbed me. After a couple of playthroughs, memorizing all of the hazard locations, I finally got to enjoy some tricky, well-designed platforming. Timing jumps off springy tires, avoiding zingers, all with the pressure of death looming with each and every leap is a wonderful time. And it seems like a lot of love and passion went into this aspect of the game. It really is amazing. And at times, the design of the game is excellent. I enjoyed this little dead-end area, informing the player they will need to jump along burning barrels to progress. It stops the player dead in their tracks and forces them to think about the way forward. This simple fire pattern is then used for the rest of the stage. The mechanic is communicated to the player in a thoughtful way. And when the game isn't zooming along at breakneck speeds or enemies darting onto the screen, surprise enemies are not an issue. Both Trick, Track, Track and Tanked Up Trouble ended up being a couple of my favorite levels in the game. Enemy avoidance and pattern recognition are the name of the game, and the player is given the time to learn the hazard and then use their skills to overcome them. I also dig the little details, like how the ground shakes when landing from a great height, giving real weight to the great ape. I even like the little differences between the two Kongs. Donkey Kong can take down most enemies with the jump, but Diddy Kong cannot. However, Diddy Kong holds barrels at chest level, making it easier to break open secret areas. There isn't much to differentiate the two characters, but enough to give each a strength and a weakness. Speaking of secret areas, I should talk about completion. Just to make sure I was getting the full DKC experience and not missing anything, I did go through and complete this game 101%. Many levels contain breakable walls or hidden barrels leading to bonus rooms. If a player finds all of them on a given stage, the stage name will then have an exclamation point. If one does this for all stages in a world, the world name will have an exclamation point. And if one does this on all of the worlds and beats the final boss, they'll complete the game. The reward for completion is minimal, but at least a final boss isn't hiding behind the quest. Speaking of bosses, these guys are poor, requiring the most basic of techniques to defeat. The hardest part of Master Neki and Master Neki Sr. is just getting the appropriate boost when bouncing off a tire. None present any sort of challenge, and Dum Drum is just a rush of standard enemies from the main campaign. They kind of feel like they are here simply because they are supposed to be, and not acting as a satisfying climax to each world. The final boss is slightly more interesting, with 3 different phases, each ending with King K. Rool tossing his crown to attack. This moment is the only time King K. Rool is vulnerable. Still, each phase escalates with 1, then 2, and finally 3 patterns before the cooldown. It's not difficult by any stretch, but far more engaging than any other enemy encounter in the game. Yeah, the enemies in Donkey Kong Country are very basic. Army is the only standard enemy in the game that will even react to the player, rolling into a ball and then charging. Every other enemy follows a predetermined path. If the player doesn't engage, the enemies will just go about their prescripted routine. On the flip side, none are what I would call annoying either, but combat is certainly not a strength of the game. The camera is also inconsistent. Most of the time it's competent, giving the player a good view of what's ahead, but also reacting quickly to changes in direction, except for the underwater section where the hero is placed right in the center, offering a more limited view. I was also disappointed the player can't look up or down to check out hazards above or below. While the camera is snappy horizontally, it's painfully slow vertically, obscuring both enemies and platforms below. It's not a deal breaker by any stretch, but at times I would have appreciated some control. So, with all of that out of the way, I feel comfortable stating Donkey Kong Country is not a masterpiece. Enemies and bosses are lacking, the camera could be better, and the game falls into the same trial and error traps many 90s platformers fell into. However, I did end up enjoying Donkey Kong Country, and I find it is a great game. After memorizing levels, one can start to appreciate a lot of the things the designers did really well. Bananas and other items do a nice job giving the player hints on bonus areas. I love the risk versus reward element with the animal buddies. Barrel placement is generally thoughtful. Other than the odd difficulty spike in Gorilla Glacier, where most of the difficulty can be bypassed with a completely hidden barrel, there is a real sense of progression. The game generally gets harder from beginning to end, with the opening worlds featuring some bottomless pits, and the final levels being nothing but bottomless pits. Levels are made more difficult with more challenging hazards, like an increase in zingers, which can only be defeated with Winky or barrels, or the inclusion of mincers, which are indestructible. Oil Drum Alley progresses nicely into Blackout Basement, first giving the player a chance to learn the flow of the set pieces, and later testing them further with flickering lights. Trick Track Trek gives the player a chance to learn how the platform moves through the environment, and Tanked Up Trouble increases the challenge by forcing the player to grab oil barrels to keep it juiced up. I also dig how the little symbol on the oil barrel will signify how much fuel is in the barrel, which then corresponds to the lights on the platform itself. I love little touches like this. Overall, Donkey Kong Country is a great game and easily one of the better platformers of the 16-bit generation. While not perfect, the graphics are certainly unique, never distracting, and are of a style which has never really been duplicated. They just scream 90s, and there is an inherent charm. The audio too is wonderful and pushes the production values over the top. And of course, the controls are just sublime, and DKC is nearly unmatched in perhaps the most important aspect of any platformer, which is of course the platforming, making this a must-own for fans of the genre. After the smashing success of Donkey Kong Country, a sequel was inevitable, and less than a year later, just 364 days, Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Kong Quest was unleashed to the world. While the title was well received upon release, some actually find the first game to be preferable. After all, it's the only game in the original trilogy to feature a playable Donkey Kong. This gave the first title the distinct flavor of having a power character and an agile one. Additionally, the game is generally considered easier, making for a more friendly experience. It also sold significantly better, leaving a much larger nostalgia footprint. Others feel Diddy's Kong Quest improves upon the original with more visual variety, a better contrast between the playable characters, and a greater variety of set pieces, making the game more engaging to play. So, is DKC 2 a superior sequel, or does the original still reign supreme? Let's dive in. Diddy's Kong Quest picks up right where the original left off. King K. Rool doesn't take kindly to being defeated after the events of the first game, so he kidnaps Donkey Kong, and it's up to Diddy and his girlfriend Dixie to rescue him. The events of the game then take place on K. Rool's turf, Crocodile Isle, which means there are all new themes and set pieces to explore and conquer. As a sequel to a game which had some seriously sublime controls, not much has really changed. The two apes control perfectly. Acceleration is quick and predictable. Jumping is responsive with a terrific jump arc and just enough hang time to feel fast and fluid rather than stiff and clumsy. And mid-air maneuverability remains excellent. As best as I can tell, Diddy Kong controls exactly the same as he did in his debut. His acceleration is quicker, especially while rolling, and he holds barrels directly in front of him. Newcomer Dixie Kong has slower acceleration, meaning more care must be taken when attacking enemies. She carries barrels above her head, and most importantly, she hovers with her helicopter hair. The decreased descent allows her to make drastically longer leaps, greatly aiding in enemy avoidance, and really changes up the platforming. At first glance, Dixie Kong might seem overpowered. However, I did find myself using Diddy Kong more than expected. I found the super fast acceleration make jumping over tall obstacles a lot easier. His roll jump is also significantly quicker, which I appreciated. And of course, holding a barrel or cannonball like a shield worked against enemies of all sizes. That isn't to say Dixie Kong is underpowered either. Her helicopter hair is as useful as one might imagine, just not always necessary. In this regard, DKC2 surpasses the original game by having a more distinct difference between the two playable characters, with each having pros and cons, and level gimmicks seeming to favor one character or the other, rewarding an easier experience when the proper Kong is selected. Even better, if a player manages to keep both Kongs alive, they can utilize a new throwing move. This can be used as a projectile attack to take down distant enemies or reach higher platforms. The upward throw is exceptionally useful, and once in the air, the thrown Kong can be gently guided left or right to land right where the player wants. As long as the thrown character isn't launched into a hazard, they can come right back like a boomerang as well, useful for grabbing items. While some may be disappointed in the lack of Donkey Kong being a playable character, I do find Rare did a wonderful job with the controls. They didn't change the core running and jumping, which were damn near perfect, but also added new wrinkles like throwing and hovering, giving DKC1 veterans something new to learn and master. Also unchanged is the game structure. DKC2 is a linear platformer, with just a single path from the shores of Crocodile Isle to the showdown against King K. Rool. Each area concludes with a boss fight, which will open up the path to the next set of levels. It's a simple formula, giving the designers more control over how a player will experience the adventure, with a single start point. Thankfully, as the game takes place on a whole new island, the set pieces are significantly different than the previous adventure. Diddy's Conquest opens in Gangplank Galleon, where the heroes battle the Kremlin crew aboard various pirate-themed ships. Crocodile Cauldron includes lava stages, overhauled mine levels, and a new twist on the underwater mechanic. Creme Quay introduces some new swamp set pieces, as well as the infamous brambles. Moving along, Crazy Kremland features amusement parks and beehives. Gloomy Gulch has ghost themes like a haunted forest and a library. Nearing the home stretch, K. Rool's Keep adds an ice level and some nifty castle stages. It's admirable how the designers were able to come up with new themes for each world without any feeling too similar, and it's also admirable they ignored the iconic daytime jungle theme and instead focused on creating an all-new adventure for returning players. What does make a return are the animal buddies. Rambi the Rhino returns, allowing the player to smash through walls and bounce along spiked enemies. On Guard the Swordfish makes underwater navigation easier with simple D-pad controls and an attack. The final returning buddy is Squawks the Parrot, though he is now a playable character with the ability to fly and launch eggs. All new for this adventure are Rattly the Rattlesnake, who can jump exceptionally high and land on spiked enemies. Squitter the Spider is perhaps the most unique of the bunch. He can shoot webs, which act as temporary platforms, and he has a second web shooter which can take out enemies. Rounding out the Animal Buddy package are Glimmer the Anglerfish, who acts as a light in a single underwater level, and Clapper the Seal. Clapper cools off water, either making boiling water safe for travel or freezing water to form a solid surface. Of course, like the Kongs, Rare didn't just stop at porting over the previous Animal Buddy moveset and calling it a day. Each of the rideable animals also has a charge attack of sorts. Rambi must use the charge attack to break through walls. On Guard's charge can be used to smash through crates, and the increased speed allows him to reach secret areas on retreating water. Lastly, Rattly can charge up for a super high jump. What I appreciate most is how these charge maneuvers are not pointless, but required to access bonus items if one is looking to complete the game. Like the throwing mechanic, the levels take advantage of the agility offered. It's also worth noting sometimes the player takes control of the Animal Buddy as a lone character, rather than an add-on. This also allowed some additional flexibility in the level design. In DKC1, the Animal Buddies were never required, meaning stages had to be designed with the limitations of the two Kongs in mind. This is not the case in DKC2. Many stages feature animal barrels which ditch the apes altogether, allowing the stages to take advantage of the animals' abilities without being handicapped by the limitations of the Kongs. It's another nice evolution to the groundwork paved by the original game. Animal barrels aren't not the only new barrels though. Invincibility barrels give the player temporary invincibility. Crockhead barrels reveal temporary platforms needed to progress in the swamps. And plus and minus barrels add and subtract from a timer in certain levels. Speaking of barrels, there is generally less barrel navigation found in Diddy's Conquest. However, this is expanded upon as well. There are new barrels which can be freely rotated by the player, and others on a timer, forcing quick thinking. There are also steerable barrels. The player can freely move about the stage. Again, the designers did a nice job taking a concept introduced in the original and greatly expanding upon it in the sequel. Also expanded on are the bosses. This was a real weak point of the first game, with all but one boss requiring the jumping attack to take down. This is rectified in Donkey Kong Country 2. Boss patterns are far more complex, requiring both pattern recognition and dexterity to defeat. Most require the use of projectile throwing as well, rather than simple jumping attacks, again requiring more skill from the player, forcing them to not only pick up an item, but also throwing the projectile with some proficiency. I also dig how after repeat attempts, players will learn patterns and can let the boss fly into them, quickening the process. Bosses are not repeated either, with the exception of Crow, with the second encounter being against the ghost of the defeated Crow, and King K. Rool, if one is going for a completionist run. Regular enemies also display a touch more competence. While most still follow a set pattern that will not be interrupted, I do appreciate how many won't begin jumping or shooting until the player is near. Others have invincibility periods where they cannot be attacked, again adding some variety and a little bit of strategy, something missing from the first game. Graphically, Donkey Kong Country 2 features the same pre-rendered style pioneered with the original, but massaged and improved. First, few things are ever pixelated to the point of being unrecognizable. It seems the artists were more aware of the resolution limitations of the Super Nintendo and tweaked their models accordingly. The result is more defined and recognizable objects and much better tiling with fewer seams. The 3D effects are also enhanced, especially in the water areas. I really dig how there appears to be 3D floors in the background of the ship, allowing the player to see the top and bottom of the layer as they move up and down the stage. This effect is also found on the water itself, allowing the player to see the surface of the water when above or below. Speaking of little touches, Donkey Kong Country 2 is chock full of them. In Gangplank Galley, the sun slowly sets as the player nears the end of the level. In fact, I didn't even notice this happening until I was skimming recorded footage. The sun literally gets lower in the background and the color palette changes accordingly. DKC 2 is chock full of animation too, and I really dig how the heroes throw their hands in the air when riding down a large drop of the roller coaster. And of course, everything else the Kongs do looks awesome, with wonderful animations for simple things like walking and running, to more complex motions like picking up a barrel. The transparencies are also utilized to a greater effect, from rolling clouds, the aforementioned water, dripping honey in the beehive levels, more convincing fog, and my absolute favorite, the moonlight poking through the trees in Ghostly Grove. It appears there's a moon in the center of the screen, and the rays shift from right to left as the player moves around. Even better, the rays will disappear and reappear as if a tree is obstructing the light as the player navigates. It looks stunning and is the coolest effect I've seen on the Super Nintendo. Less impressive are the transparent enemies. It's an obvious use for transparencies for sure, but coming from a primarily Sega Genesis childhood, I appreciate seeing this effect on such old hardware. About the only fault I have with the graphics is an increased amount of slowdown. I certainly can't know if the game is hitting a sprite limit on the hardware or if there's some unoptimized code in the game engine, but I notice slowdown far more frequently in DKC 2. Still, overall, the graphics are both technically and artistically more pleasing than the original, which was a beautiful game in its own right. Moving along, let's talk about the audio. As frequently noted, the soundtrack is nothing short of epic. Right from the start, the player is treated with some atmospheric creaking ship sounds before a song fades into existence. Underwater areas sound tense and dark, matching the eerie feeling one might expect in a sunken ship. The lava levels feature a terrific synth tune mixed with subtle bubbling sounds as the lava lava boils in the background. The mine areas utilize an instrument set that resembles working with metal tools on a railroad or a pickaxe smashing a rock. The unique instrument selection carries over in the swamp level, where part of the music is made up of what appears to be buzzing insect sounds. I'm not sure how to explain the bramble area music, but there is some depth rarely experienced during this generation. There are haunting notes which seem to linger on forever, while some bassy notes add an underlying hint of drama, and higher pitched notes add urgency to these generally challenging levels. It's all very beautiful and is one of my favorite pieces found in the franchise thus far. The coaster levels are all techno, but also feature a few light screams, giving them both an eerie feel, but the screams are what one might expect if watching someone zip along on a roller coaster. The variety and quality never lets up either, with the final castle levels featuring an almost Disney-like quality, sounding like an orchestra. Sound effects are also improved, lacking annoying biting sounds or white noise static. I also really dug the ending sequences for both heroes, with Diddy featuring a little boombox rap and Dixie rocking out with an electric guitar. Needless to say, the sound presentation is as amazing as the visuals, with a more diverse soundtrack featuring catchier melodies and a wider instrument selection, and a more consistent quality with the sound effects. I honestly can't even find a nitpick. It's an audio treat from beginning to end. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get back to my main question. Is Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Kong Quest superior to the original game? To answer this question, I want to address my main complaints with the first title. Granted, I still find DKC 1 to be a great game. I just wouldn't call it a masterpiece. Enemy behavior was basic. The camera didn't always provide the best view. Enemies would surprise the player, especially underwater and on the minecarts. The game had a fetish for bottomless pits. Collision detection was poor at times, the save system was inconsistent, bosses were lackluster, and the difficulty often relied on trial and error. Despite being released just under a year later, Rare did manage to address most of these concerns. As noted, the bosses are vastly superior and enemy behavior more complex. During the roller coaster sections and underwater, enemies just didn't race onto the screen, causing damage. Enemies feel more thoughtfully placed and their interaction with the environment more thoughtful, almost completely alleviating the trial and error difficulty. While Donkey Kong Country 2 still has a ton of bottomless pits, it's far less prevalent here. There is a ton more vertical gameplay, and falling will surprisingly not always result in death. Instead, the punishment for poor play is to retry a section of the level, which is more preferable in a game which doesn't allow saving between all levels. The collision detection is also improved, and I don't have a single example of jumping on an enemy resulting in taking damage. Now, maybe this is because both Diddy and Dixie are smaller than the Donkey Kong sprite, allowing for a more precise and predictable hitbox, or maybe the collision programming was improved. I can't say for certain, but I never found myself taking surprise damage, and the collision detection remained favorable to the player, allowing one to hit an enemy as long as they are slightly above. However, two items weren't improved at all. The save system is still needlessly complicated. Upon entering a world, a player cannot save the game until finally unlocking Wrinkly Kong, but saving is no longer free, and the player needs to spend banana coins for the privilege of saving. This is free the first time in each world, but then costs a coin every time thereafter. In the Western version, this costs 2 banana coins, but was reduced to 1 in the Japanese release. In either case, while a minor annoyance, racking up a large banana coin count is surprisingly easy, until one shuts off their console. Upon reloading a save, the life counter resets to 5 and the banana coins reset to 0. I've absolutely no idea why this happens, but it sucks to rack up a large life counter only to have it all taken away if one needs to step away from the game. Another high-profile platformer from 1995, Rayman, didn't do this, letting a player retain all of their lives every time they reloaded a save file, so it seems this unnecessary handicap only exists to troll the player. Speaking of of difficulty, despite the reduction in trial and error and fewer surprise enemies, Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Conquest manages to be even more challenging than the original. More is asked of the player than ever before. Some obstacles are now on a timer or chase the player, forcing the player to make quick decisions and execute flawlessly. But just about every challenge is of the fair variety, so there is a real sense of accomplishment when challenges are overcome, which is a good thing. Though I do find the checkpoint system to be as needlessly restrictive as the save system. You see, I enjoy the sense of accomplishment when overcoming an obstacle, but having to redo a challenge over and over to make it a little farther sucks when a game is 7 to 8 hours long. For whatever reason, each level features just a single checkpoint barrel, which means repeating the same stretches of levels over and over with each death. The achievement of overcoming something difficult is snatched away from the player all too quickly, and I suspect this is the reason Donkey Kong Country games are not held in the same regard as the Sonic and Mario games. Sonic the Hedgehog features loads of checkpoints in every level, ensuring a player won't have to redo too much upon failure. With Donkey Kong Country, moments of the game feel padded out due to ridiculous level lengths and sparse checkpoints. Repeating long sections of Red Hot Ride or Web Woods starts to become a real grind after the third or fourth death. This isn't a skill problem either. I completed the game 102% twice. Rather, I feel if a game is going to demand such precision and skill from the player, then standard structural elements like checkpoints and saving should be adjusted accordingly. Take the 2010 hit Limbo, for example. This game is brutally difficult. The player needs to solve complex puzzles and perform actions perfectly in order to progress. And like Donkey Kong Country 2, there is an immense feeling of satisfaction when overcoming each and every insane challenge. However, the game automatically saves after each and every obstacle, which doubles as the game's checkpoint. There is no point where the feeling of victory is taken away from the player and they are forced to repeat something. Granted, I can now cruise through DKC2 without much of an issue, but the sense of padding lingers with each death. Speaking of padding, another pace breaker is how slow parts of the game are. This is evident with the aforementioned Red Hot Ride and Web Woods. First, I must applaud the developers for the increased variety in obstacles and hazards. This hot air balloon ride is really interesting. The player needs to guide the balloon to heat, causing the balloon to rise, and then race to the next one before it drops into the lava. But it goes on forever. Same goes for Web Woods. The spider is a neat concept. I like how the player can control the web platforms or web projectile with the up and down buttons, giving even greater flexibility. But there is no doubt these sections are slow, and having to redo large chunks of these slow sections because of the lack of checkpoints is a real pace breaker. When people say they don't like the Donkey Kong Country series, I get it. Getting repeatedly kicked when down is not a fun experience. And then there is Squawks the Parrot. Controlling this bird is like swimming, but worse. The learning curve is exceptionally steep. In addition to rapidly pressing the flat button to achieve lift, the up button also needs to be held to increase the speed. Moving downward also feels odd, with two different descent speeds, one achieved while pressing nothing and a second while pressing down. It all feels very busy and more complicated than necessary. Unfortunately, mastering the controls is mandatory because Squawks features the hardest levels found in the game. Bramble Scramble appears first, requiring the player to navigate tight corridors with the complicated flight controls. Avoiding enemies is one thing, but also not being able to touch the ceiling, floor, or walls becomes overwhelming and represents a rather high difficulty spike in the adventure. The boss fight, King Zing Sting, is interesting because it's a fight utilizing new mechanics, but hitting the stinger with the arced egg shot is extremely awkward to perform without taking damage. Parachute Panic actually features a different bird, one lacking flight. Instead, the player needs to slowly guide the heroes down long paths avoiding zingers. The player will be tasked with pressing up to reduce speed and pressing the speed button to zip left and right. The clearances here are insanely tight, and any lapse in concentration is sure to result in damage or death. And of course, there is just one checkpoint. Last but not least is Screech's Sprint. For some unknown reason, the player is forced to race another bird to the finish line. This means an absolute mastery of the flight mechanics is required to beat the opponent, moving as quickly as possible up, down, and across to clear the level. And because it's a race, a first-time player is sure to smack into walls or enemies in their quest for speed, adding a trial and error element sure to frustrate even the most hardened of gamers. It took me well over an hour to get through this the first time, and I absolutely hated it. And if one is going for 102% completion, it gets even worse. Like the first game, DKC2 has bonus barrels, which will send the player to a bonus room to complete a task. This is either finding a creme coin, defeating all enemies, or nabbing a set number of stars. The reward for each of these is a creme coin, of which there are 75. Unlike DKC1, where just getting to a bonus room was enough to complete the game, DKC2 requires each timed bonus room to be completed. The 75 creme coins are then used to unlock 15 hidden levels in the Lost World. Beating these 5 levels will unlock a true final boss and a new ending sequence. These 5 levels are brutal, requiring perfect accuracy while bouncing off tires, a slippery ice world filled with zingers, some of the most insane barrel challenges yet devised, those steerable barrels, and finally, the madness that is Animal Antics. Animal Antics has a squawk segment in a windy area. Yeah, wind. This is actually used a few times, with the wind either being triggered by the player when reaching a trigger point, or a back and forth pattern. It works well enough, changing up the jumping formula, adding some variety. But when wind is mixed with flight, the result is the single most frustrating level found in the game. Anything but the most brief of inputs will send the bird smashing into the brambles, which is incredibly annoying. And of course, there is no checkpoint after clearing this obstacle course, so if one dies on the next section of the level, they have to do the squawk section all over again. There is one final element to completing Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Conquest, the 40 DK coins. Every level has a hidden DK coin, which can be found in a bonus stage, the regular part of the level, or hiding in the minigame at the end of the level. However, to get all 40, the player will also need to find the bonus stage hidden in each Lost World, which is how the final 5 are obtained. This will reward the player first place in Cranky's Video Game Heroes and allow one to reach 102% on their save file. But outside of perhaps nostalgia, I'm not sure the pain and persistence needed for these rewards is really worth it. There are a few other things that are sure to kill the player as well. The level boundary isn't handled consistently. Sometimes the player can jump into the abyss. Sometimes there is a barrier causing the character to hit their head and immediately go back down. The camera will also spaz out as it isn't able to pan where the player isn't allowed to go. This happened just once in the first game, which was infrequent enough for me to not even mention it. But when the character is off screen, the camera jerks and there's no way for the player to know where the character is. I also hate how the camera doesn't always pan downwards when hovering with Dixie, which basically amounts to leaps of faith. And of course, there is still no player control to look up and down. On the bright side, holding down actually comes in handy in this game, so the animation frames aren't wasted. My final control quibbles are related to Dixie. She cannot engage her helicopter hair after bouncing off an enemy, nor when jumping off sticky honey. It's an odd restriction, and it took me a while to adjust to a control input not being reflected with an action. I see no real reason for this restriction, but whatever. So, I think I've clearly demonstrated why many may not have the same fondness for Donkey Kong Country 2 as others, and in some respects I can see why people might prefer the original. However, I still find Diddy's Conquest to be better designed overall. It's not just the reduced trial and error, with the one exception, or the reduction in BS enemy placement. DKC2 does a much better job communicating with the player. This is most obvious in the coaster levels. The first coaster level has the player touching switches to open up doors, and also avoiding switches which will close a door, causing damage. Thankfully, memorization is not required to overcome these challenges. Instead, the banana placement communicates to the player what to do. If there's a trail of bananas, the player should follow the trail to hit the switch. If there isn't a trail, the player should avoid the switch. And of course, some banana trails guide the player away from bad switches. There is even a banana to guide the player over a surprise barrier barrel throw, which is pretty awesome. The banana placement is sometimes even more obvious, with arrows alerting the player to secrets, even off-screen secrets, which I really appreciate. I also really dig how this Kremlin randomly shoots out a super slow cannon shot. It's odd, but if the player was paying attention to an earlier clue, they'll find this cannonball will smash through a wall, revealing a bonus. It's clever and thoughtful, and more often than not, Donkey Kong Country 2 is communicating to the player how to proceed through the level with few surprises. Last but not least, outside of squawks, the quality of the gameplay and level design never dips. Be it swimming with On Guard, slinging webs with Squitter, or bouncing off zingers with Rambi, each and every animal buddy feels like an integral part of the adventure. Stage gimmicks like sticky honey, roller coasters, hot air balloons, wind, barrels, and ghost ropes keep the game feeling fresh from beginning to end. At the end of the day, outside of the camera and flight mechanics, Donkey Kong Country 2 is superior to the original. The controls are as smooth and responsive as ever, and the new moves give the player even more flexibility with overcoming obstacles. The graphics are improved with more color and contrast, and a smoother, less pixelated look overall. The diversity of the set pieces is also amazing, and I really dig the beehive and swamp areas. And most importantly, the game is designed better, with better level layouts, better enemy behavior, and more engaging bosses. While completing the adventure is far more tedious, it's also completely optional. And the main campaign is a far more comprehensive and polished experience. In closing, while DKC 1 was a great game in its own right, DKC 2 is an improvement. While it did frustrate the hell out of me, most of the challenges of the fair variety, and there is little doubt much more care went into item, enemy, and hazard placement, and to come out just 364 days after the first title is an amazing achievement, almost as amazing as the game itself. Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble is often regarded as the black sheep of the original DKC trilogy. Being released during the formative years of the 5th generation console war, few seem to have much nostalgia for this 1996 installment of the series. However, to my surprise, DKC 3 was actually successful, selling 3.5 million units worldwide. In fact, it was a top 10 selling game for the system. Not bad for a late release. Even more surprising is how well the game was received critically. You see, like many, I've always been under the impression DKC 3 marked a dramatic dip in quality. But it turns out Dixie Kong's Double Trouble was reviewed highly by the critics. In the February '97 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly, the 4 reviewers collectively scored the game 32.5 out of 40, giving it their Editor's Choice Silver Award, while incorrectly labeling it a PlayStation game, and noted, "Clean graphics, solid gameplay, and hip sounds make DKC 3 an all-around great title for all ages." The January '97 issue of GamePro was even more positive, scoring the game a 4.75 out of 5, stating, "If this is the SNES's swan song, then at least the great old system is going out in style." Early internet reviews were equally positive. The All Game Guide scored the game 4.5 stars out of 5, proclaiming, "Even though it is similar to the previous games in the series, video games just don't get much better than this." So, is Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble still as good as the critical reviews of the day, or as bad as the cynics have since declared? Let's dive in. Like its predecessors, DKC 3 is light on story. The game just sort of begins in an all-new overworld, and the player is forced to visit Wrinkly Kong. As I'm playing the Japanese version, I have no idea what is going on. Next, the player visits Funky, who constructs a boat, opening up the next area of the map. DKC 3 then slowly reveals new levels for the player, with the hovercraft allowing travel over rocks, and the turbo ski allowing travel over a waterfall. While mostly linear, it does give the slight illusion of being an adventure title while still nudging the player along a predetermined path. Despite this wrinkle, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble is still a 16-bit platformer at its core. Players make their way through 5 levels in a given world, battle a boss, and then move on to the next world. Standard stuff. Also standard is the introduction of a new character. The first game had Diddy, the second had Dixie, and now we have Kiddy Kong, a giant baby ape. This marks the return of the power character, giving DKC 3 its own flavor. Of course, this does mean the speed character is missing, but the tag tag team gameplay is as engaging as ever. Dixie's helicopter hair is useful, allowing slower descents and longer jump distances. Kiddy Kong has a traditional jump. Thankfully, the jump height is nice, and there is maneuverability while in the air, allowing for confident leaps and precision when bashing enemies. The only downside of having two slower characters is I rarely use the rolling attacks. Jumping was simply faster. Kiddy Kong can use the roll in conjunction with the jump to skip over water though, which is needed to access a couple of bonus barrels. Also tweaked are the team-up attacks. Kiddy Kong can throw Dixie and it works just like the previous title, allowing for a projectile attack or being used to reach higher platforms. On the other hand, Dixie is severely handicapped when carrying Kiddy. She moves painfully slow, for example, but Kiddy can be used to smash through a couple of designated platforms. On the surface, this may seem like a negative, but it actually gives each character distinct, rather than subtle, differences. Players are more incentivized than ever to keep both Kongs alive. Kiddy needs to stick around for smashing larger enemies and for his superior throwing. Dixie needs to be kept around for her floating. More subtle are the hitboxes. Kiddy is quite the beast, and I actually found for bonus rooms where the goal was to collect stars, his increased girth made nabbing stars easier. Some may be offended by the baby's design, but I find the overall aesthetic to be about on par with Bonk or Chuck Jr. Also new are additional animal buddies like Ellie the elephant. She can jump on enemies but will run away from sneaks. She can use her trunk to snag nearby barrels and toss them. Finally, if there is water in the area, she can suck some up with her trunk and then shoot it out as an attack. This adds some puzzle elements to the gameplay and makes her levels feel like a nice evolution to the buddies, without straying too far from the established formula of running, jumping, and tossing barrels. Sticking with this puzzle theme is Quawks. He is similar to Squawks, but cannot shoot an endless barrage of eggs. Instead, he can pick up barrels and then release them at enemies or use them like a shield. Finally, there is Perry the Parallel Bird. This guy hovers just above the player, and levels are designed around him snaking items out of the player's reach. There are often separate obstacles in his path too, giving more for the player to contend with. Returning are On Guard, Squawks, and Squitter, and all control exactly like they did in the previous title, so I won't elaborate. There are also new barrels to interact with. Booster barrels launch the Kongs high up in the air to traverse waterfalls. Switch barrels have a large S on them and switch other barrels from TNT or wooden to steel kegs and then back. Ghost barrels will fade in and out, sometimes being a detriment to the player and other times a benefit. There's also a rocket barrel, which is featured in the final level of Krematoa, this game's version of Lost World. Overall, I have to say Donkey Kong Country 3 meets my expectations for what Donkey Kong Country 3 should be. A previous character is replaced, some animal buddies stick around for another go, and outgoing buddies are swapped with new ones. And of course, there are new barrels for the player to interact with, keeping the adventure feeling fresh for those who have played the previous installments. What is different is a slight change in focus. Now, don't get me wrong, DKC3 is a platformer true and true. The game challenges the player to run and jump through dozens of levels and reach the flagpole at the end of each stage. However, the main campaign feels slightly less hardcore. While precision platforming is still the name of the game, there are many moments where a little more thought and reason is asked of the player. Doorstop Dash has the player pulling on levers to open up doors and then race through them before they close. In Squeals on Wheels, the player needs to knock mice out of wheels to lower a gauge, eventually allowing progress. The aforementioned Quawks is needed to strategically drop barrels to take down buzzes. That isn't to say there isn't some more hardcore platforming. The chase levels are some of the toughest in the game. Ripsaw Rage has the player running up hollowed out trees to try and escape a saw racing up the screen. Kong-fused Cliffs forces the player up ropes which have been ignited, and there are familiar challenges like the classic barrels falling down a waterfall trope. However, Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble definitely represents an evolution of the difficulty formula. While there are moments of navigating rotating barrels, it's not as frequent. Same goes for bottomless pits. They are sprinkled here and there, but are no longer the primary hazard. In their place are some tough enemy patterns. When done correctly, avoiding fighting fireball hazards, skillfully bouncing off penguins, and navigating around helicopter enemies is fun and engaging. Failure won't always result in an instant death though, with the tag team partner being retained for a second attempt or free pass. Also evolved are the bosses. Each of the 7 main worlds ends with a boss fight against a creature fitting the theme. The result is a vast array of strange creatures to fight, though the difficulty is tamed throughout. Belcha tosses out barrels containing bugs, which can be hopped on once to incapacitate them and then thrown inside the enemy's mouth. After digesting the insect, Belcha belches, sending it backwards. It does a decent job using both the jumping and throwing mechanics while not resorting to tossing barrels. The barrels do return during the Eric fight. The player is tasked with dodging the boss's projectiles and then tossing a barrel into its face. This boss is made significantly easier with Dixie. As she holds barrels above her head, one can allow the boss to simply smash into it, rewarding players who play to the strengths of each Kong. Squirt Showdown utilizes Ellie, challenging the player to maneuver around the stage avoiding a water attack, and then unleashing Ellie's water attack during the cooldown period. The fourth boss gives the player the first taste of chaos, a barrel-like robot. While the bosses up to this point have been easy, this one ups the difficulty. The player must dodge a fire attack, then skillfully traverse up some temporary platforms to bonk the boss on the head. The worst boss fight is against Bleak, the snowman. Everything about this boss feels sloppy. The player needs to throw snowballs at the snowman, which seems counterproductive, while also avoiding incoming attacks. In between these is some dodging where the snowman cannot be hit. The fight itself isn't awful, but there is a dip in quality. The boss has minimal animation frames, making it look choppy, and his laugh is cringy. The gameplay mechanic and art style just clash with the rest of the game, making this feel gimmicky rather than innovative. Thankfully, Barbos is much better. Here, it is Enguarde's time to shine, utilizing his unique ability to actually dish damage underwater. The enemies in the first phase require timing to hit, as they aren't always vulnerable. The second phase requires precision swimming and avoidance maneuvers to cause shells to charge the boss. The last phase requires the player to dodge an increasing number of spike attacks. The patterns are complex, and it's nice to see Enguarde used to full effect for this third adventure. Rare saved the best for last with King K. Rool. The battle against Chaos is fine, but the King K. Rool fight is awesome. There is a constant threat of electricity on the bottom of the screen, but it can be utilized to harm the Nemesis as well. The goal becomes figuring out how to launch barrels into the helicopter blades of King K. Rool's contraption, dropping him into the electricity. Like the previous final bosses, there are patterns to learn, tough attacks to perform, and a decent skill level necessary for success. So, DKC3 features a nice evolution of the Donkey Kong Country formula with all new barrels, new animal buddies, and a new hero. The level design continues to be massaged to incorporate more puzzles and timing elements. The bosses have retained a decent quality level and are a vast improvement over DKC1. And finally, the tag team formula is as good as ever, with an agile character and a power character, complete with new moves and a more defined throwing difference. On paper, DKC3 should be a satisfying conclusion to the Donkey Kong Country trilogy. But at some point in history, a vocal minority started turning their back on this entry. Most angst was aimed squarely at Kiddy himself. His inclusion meant fan favorite Donkey Kong was not playable, and some seemed bothered by the concept of a giant ape baby, from his little tantrum animation to his footy pajamas. Next, many find the soundtrack to be lackluster, missing both the ambiance and emotion from the first two games. The final complaint lobbed at DKC3 is it being too gimmicky, using gimmicks to spice up the gameplay rather than solid game design. Starting with Kiddy, I have to admit a giant baby the size of Donkey Kong is, well, odd, but the character certainly has some charm, and this comes from those expressive eyes. He looks absolutely adorable on the game over screen, and I love the little wink when grabbing bonus coins. He also looks like my fat cat when he sits down, which is disturbing yet comforting. And of course, if one doesn't want to hear Kiddy Kong cry, well, get good. If someone was going to make an objective argument against his inclusion, one should look at the series as a whole. Assuming one were to play these games in order, be it back in 1994 or today, the player would be getting older as they make their way through the trilogy. However, with each DKC installment, the cast is getting younger. The first game has an adult, the last game has a baby. The character design is is not growing with the audience. Next is the soundtrack. Let me start by saying the opening track in Lakeside Limbo is not pleasing. Maybe it's the drab instrument selection, but it lacks the hook needed to draw players in. Oddly enough, the next level features terrific music. While roaming around an old barn, the player is treated to some wonderful lounge vibes featuring awesome instrument selections and some genuinely catchy melodies. The music in Crevice Keepers feels like Rare back to their old form, with heavy drums and haunting guitar strums offering a real sense of tension as the player navigates the mountainside cliffs. In fact, once one arrives at the later worlds of the game, the moody and dark tones the series has been known for are featured more frequently. In some ways, the arc of the entire adventure shifts. DKC3 starts off light and bouncy, but the tone changes as the player gets closer to their goal, getting more bleak as the danger level increases. While nothing comes close to the best tracks found in the previous games, the soundtrack is still way above average and doesn't receive the acclaim it rightfully deserves. Finally, let's talk about the gimmicks. The level of variety in Dixie Kong's Double Trouble is quite high. This includes the aforementioned rats running on wheels, but also levels like Fish Food Frenzy. Here, the player is being followed by a hungry fish. The goal is to have him eat the clownfish and avoid the undesirables, like critters with spikes. Fail to feed him or feed him too many spikes and he'll turn red and attack the player. Lightning Lookout features lightning. It will telegraph its striking point and the player is tasked with getting out of the way, hiding beneath an enemy, or grabbing a barrel. The player will also need to avoid the water, which conducts electricity. Coin Dozer Clamor features a bunch of coin dozers. These guys will charge the Kongs and push them off ledges with their shield. The only way to get past them is to land directly above them, using their shields as platforms. The classic minecart mechanic also returns, in the form of sleds. Like before, the player is tasked with dodging obstacles, bouncing off enemies, and following banana clues while racing along an auto-scrolling level. Generally speaking, the level gimmicks don't feel gimmicky. Rather, their thoughtfulness and implementation feels like an integral part of the experience, rather than something tacked on for the sake of variety. To better explain what a bad gimmick is, let's take a look at the proverbial punching bag that is Sonic 06. Shadow has a number of vehicle stages, but the vehicles control poorly and the stages don't seem designed with the vehicles in mind, making for an unsatisfying experience. Same goes for this area on a giant floating sphere. It's a mind-numbingly slow experience and would never work as a standalone game. Super Monkey Ball, this is not. Therefore, I would say most of the so-called gimmicks found in Donkey Kong Country 3 are not really gimmicks at all. The controls are never a problem, implementation is terrific, and removing them would take away from the overall experience, rather than enhance it. But I'd be a fool to say the designers nailed them all. The reversed controls and poisonous pipelines are tedious. Now, in the final boss fight in DKC2, reversed controls were used as a punishment for failing to dodge one of K. Rool's attacks. In DKC3, reversed controls are not a punishment for poor play, but rather forced upon the player. The controls revert to normal when jumping out of the water too, adding unnecessary complexity. Moving on, let's talk about the one thing I feel Donkey Kong Country 3 truly excels at. The graphics are stunning. While the opening stage has a weak music track to kick off the adventure, the graphic fidelity is amazing. First, I love the way the mountains reflect off the lake, complete with a little ripple. But even cooler is how the player is also able to see the lake floor. The artistic vision with the transparencies and line scrolling effects to make it all work is outstanding, and this ranks up there with the Beehive and Swamp as one of my favorite level themes found in the trilogy. The hollowed out trees are also fantastic. The depth depth and detail of the bark, branches, and the convincing shadows look amazing and are a massive improvement over similar themes in other games of the time. In fact, I'd say the artists had a firm grasp on not only the 3D modeling process, but also sprite digitization. Underwater areas look realistic and vivid, giving a convincing sense of an ocean reef. Not everything is outdoors though. The sewers look grimy and gritty, and factory stages have a distinct lived-in aesthetic to them. Donkey Kong Country 3 also feels like a much brighter game. While snow is again used to liven things up, mountain areas are equally bright, like years of weathering have worn rocks down to a shine, allowing the sun to reflect off them. Overall, the level themes are easily up there with the best of the series, with a wide array of different light levels, a huge amount of color, and a good variety of organic themes and man-made. Transparencies are also expertly utilized, not only for the sewer goo and water, but these amazing waterfalls. They look great, and I love how platforms will go behind them, along with the characters, and the waterfall reacts accordingly. Even the saw is brighter when outside of the tree. The only downside to all of this graphical wizardry is the frame rate. Of course, I can't know if the programmers and artists were pushing the Super Nintendo to its limit, or if the game engine wasn't as optimized as it could have been, but the level design isn't always mindful of the limitations, causing the game to slow down when the action gets heavy. So, the soundtrack is good, the graphics are awesome, and the level of variety vast. Donkey Kong Country 3 nails the presentation, combined with the gameplay tweaks noted earlier, and it would seem DKC3 is a competent game. But I'd take it a step further and say this game is great. I went into depth about the amazing controls in the first video of the series, so I won't belabor the point, but like its predecessors, Donkey Kong Country 3 has brilliant controls. Starting, stopping, changing directions, jumping, and landing all feel perfect with excellent momentum and little slip. I also find the level design to be great. First, the game does a nice job communicating things to the player. I am playing the Japanese version for economic reasons, and I had no problems figuring out the controls and concepts of the new animal buddies. For example, when the player is introduced to Ellie the elephant, she can bounce off sneaks without issue. However, later in the level she freaks out and runs away because the sneak is now illuminated by light. The player will need to take them out from a distance. And how does a player know they can manipulate barrels? Well, if one doesn't figure it out organically by holding Y to run, there are bananas in the shape of a Y to hammer the point home. There is a bonus barrel underneath a cracked wooden plank with a large A, again alerting the player to a new move. In fact, the game is littered with banana hints. Ellie's ability to store water and then use it as a weapon is hinted at with a large L and R. Now, I'm not saying placing items in the shapes of letters is brilliant game design in itself, but it does show the designers put thought into the placement of even the most basic things. DKC3 is also void of anything I would call cheap. There are no sporadic enemy patterns meant to trick the player. Instead, patterns can be learned and overcome without trial and error deaths. Same goes for those bosses. Having never played this game before, I had no idea how most of these worked, but because the game allowed ample time to experiment, I was able to overcome each and every one of them without cheap deaths or the use of a guide. In fact, about the only time I felt level gimmicks and enemy placement didn't quite jive with the moveset available was on Conveyor Rope Flash. These conveyor ropes move ridiculously fast, and it can be difficult to discern their direction while simultaneously avoiding enemies. Granted, this level is near the end, when the difficulty is at its highest, but it is one of the few times I felt the game was a little unfair. Saving and checkpoints are also improved. First, the player can finally save their game whenever they please. One doesn't need to play 3 or 4 levels prior to reaching a save point, nor is there any cost to said feature. The player is free to leave a world at any time and visit Wrinkly Kong to save, even if one hasn't reached the save cave on the current world. This is a massive improvement over the previous games and made my first playthrough far less tedious. I was allowed to focus on each level individually and save upon victory. Of the original trilogy, I would say this is the most friendly. The most frustrating aspects, like rotating barrels and bottomless pits, are far more sparse. The save system is no longer restricted, and levels never wear out their welcome, meaning a return to a checkpoint is never a deflating feeling. The lack of deflating feeling made the adventure through the Northern Cremisphere to take on chaos a real treat. And while the game generally fails to tell a story from a visual sense, the reveal of King K. Rool as the mastermind is cool and a nice nod to Oz. For many, this will be the end of the journey, but I ended up completing DKC3 twice, and I think 1996 is around the time where the collectathon subgenre really started. The game is packed with collectibles. First are the bonus coins. These are obtained by locating the 2 bonus barrels in every level, and then beating the bonus level. For those looking for a challenge, these bonus stages should scratch that itch. Goals like getting through an obstacle course or defeating all enemies return and make for satisfying breaks in the action, but the star bonus areas return with a vengeance, really forcing the player to master the various mechanics to be successful. New is a 15-banana grab, where a banana will appear in a random spot on the screen and the player is tasked with grabbing it before it disappears. These are easily the toughest in the game, and I found myself repeating them a few times during my non-recorded runs. 4 of the bosses will also reward a bonus coin, for a total of 74. These bonus coins are used to unlock stages in Crematoa, a hidden bonus world. The player can use the bonus coins to blast open rocks to unlock 5 new levels. Each of these new levels also features bonus barrels, and when the dust settles, the player will have collected 85 coins. The Crematoa levels are hard, but none approach the maddening difficulty found in the lost world of DKC2. Beating each of these levels rewards a cog, and all 5 will reveal the true final boss fight against King K. Rool for the second time. This won't be enough to complete the game though, but it does unlock a final vehicle for the Kongs, which can fly all across the overworld. Next, there are bear coins. These are used to buy a mirror and a shell from the bear shop. Just 55 are needed to complete the game, and this is all but guaranteed to happen just by playing the game, so no big deal. This does kick off a strange side quest where the player needs to visit the various bear cabins of the worlds and the overworld, trading items and earning a few of the 15 banana birds. The rest of the banana birds are hidden in caves. Each cave contains a progressively more difficult game of Simon with each discovery, and rewards the remaining banana birds. After gathering all of them, Wrinkly Kong will take the Kongs to the Banana Bird Queen. With all of her children present, she is freed from captivity, and she takes down King K. Rool for the final time. The final cutscene isn't amazing, but charming in its own way. But this won't complete the game either. There are 41 DK coins to collect as well. All 40 stages have an enemy called a coin, which the player must defeat by strategically throwing a steel barrel and having it ricochet into their back. This is sometimes really easy, and sometimes requires an elaborate setup to achieve. Acquiring a steel barrel isn't always a gimme either, with the player sometimes getting a single barrel as a bonus for maintaining an animal through the end point. If one fails to perform the throw correctly, they'll have to repeat the stage to get another attempt. Some bonus barrels work in the same way. Worse yet, a few levels have no meaningful way to backtrack, forcing the player to restart the level from the beginning to try again. Honestly, as this is only required to complete the game, it's hard for me to be too annoyed. These are optional after all. Still, grabbing all of the bonus coins, DK coins, the 5 cogs, and the banana birds will reward the player with a 103% on their save file, a fitting conclusion for the third adventure. For those seeking the ultimate experience, there is also a hard mode, which eliminates most DK barrels and all checkpoints for maximum difficulty. Completing the game on hard mode will reward 105% for those inclined. So, with all of that out of the way, I have to conclude Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble is as good as those old reviews claim, and not worthy of its black sheep reputation. DKC3 is a great game, the controls are sublime, the level variety is terrific with a good mix of horizontal and vertical movement, loads of tricky jumping, and plenty of alternate paths when utilizing the throwing mechanics of the Kongs. The tag team mechanic is as polished as ever, with each character character having distinct strengths and weaknesses. Did I miss the quickness of Diddy Kong and his super fast rolling jump? Sure, but that wasn't the sole reason the first two games were so great, so its omission is not a deal breaker. DKC3 borrows heavily from its predecessors in terms of gameplay, but the shift in focus from avoiding pits to light puzzles is a welcome change and really helps this game stand on its own without feeling like old hat. Dixie Kong's Double Trouble might also mark the high point of the 90s pre-rendered graphics fad. Environments are bright, vivid, varied, and detailed with just the right mix of realism and fantasy, creating appealing worlds to platform through. The difficulty curve is also excellent, with the opening stages being breezy, allowing one to learn the ropes, and the final stages being the gauntlet the series is known for. This might even have the best difficulty curve of the bunch, with few difficulty spikes in the middle of the game. Camera jank and collision issues are also absent. While the bosses remain mediocre, they were never the highlight of Donkey Kong Country, so it's hard to get too upset about it. Mix in an underrated soundtrack and a ton of replayability with the completion goals into hard mode, and Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble is a wonderful send-off for the Super Nintendo. While some may be disappointed with Kiddy Kong or some other elements not meeting their expectations, I'm struggling to find many faults with the game. It's a wonderful platformer and easily stands toe-to-toe with the best platformers of the era. Donkey Kong Land is a curious title with a strange reputation. It was met with critical acclaim back in '95. The Electric Playground gave the game a 9 out of 10, describing it as illustrious. Consoles Plus magazine scored the game a 92%, declaring it a mega hit. A few years later, the All Game Guide gave it 4 out of 5 stars, naming it one of the best platformers available for the Game Boy. However, as time wears on, reviewers have become less kind to the 8-bit platformer. Many find the sprites blend in with the backgrounds. The level design doesn't match the limited resolution. Slippery controls make landing a dicey proposition, and the hit detection can be inconsistent. Per usual, I am a firm proponent of the games can age philosophy. Much like music, film, or other forms of art and entertainment, some games stand the test of time, and others are clearly a product of it. So, which is Donkey Kong Land? Let us dive in. DKL doesn't mess around with story bits. Select a save file and the game begins. The instruction manual alludes to Cranky Kong advising Donkey Kong Country was only popular because of the presentation, with Donkey and Diddy Kong arguing it was the gameplay which made it such a hit. To settle this argument is Donkey Kong Land. I suspect Rare was a bit annoyed with Country's reputation being more about its pre-rendered visuals and soundtrack rather than the superb gameplay, with DK Land attempting to prove it is all about the gameplay. As I don't care much for bad stories taking up an inordinate amount of gameplay time, what is here is just fine. Donkey and Diddy on an epic quest to take down King K. Rool. Perfect. As this is a Game Boy game with limited buttons, the gameplay is exceptionally simple. Players can roll into enemies, hold the button for additional speed, and jump. That is it. However, there are a few things I don't like about the jumping. First, the Kongs feel sort of slippery, and it can be difficult to stop forward momentum. This makes landing on small platforms tricky. Second, the Kongs gain full momentum when bouncing off enemies. This sudden change of speed is jarring, and sudden speed changes are the last thing I want when playing a game at such low resolution. This control quirk is rarely a problem, and I don't want to blow it out of proportion. However, it also makes a few key levels far worse than they should be. It creates some pace-breaking speed bumps, and I'm sure many first-time players will experience frustration during a few key levels. Rig and Rumble is the first major obstacle. The hiccup for me was caused by the strange momentum when bouncing off enemies. It appears the player is guided to bounce from one enemy to the next. However, it doesn't work in practice. The game is either trolling the player or pixel-perfect precision is necessary to complete the jump as the designers intended. I can't be certain. Regardless of the designer's intent, what the player will feel is trial and error difficulty. In Kremlantis, the difficulty spike is Snake Charmer's challenge. The difficulty mostly arises from baskets of snakes racing at the player from off-screen, and less so because of the jumping, although having to bounce off enemies on small platforms is certainly a feature of the level. The most infamous stage is Sky High Caper. This baffling difficult level occurs in the third world, rather than the last, which I find curious. Anyway, the jumping and screen crunch make this level the most difficult in the game. While on a shifting platform where the platform changes when it hits the edge of a track or the player jumps, one has to contend with flying pig enemies. The problem arises when bouncing off the enemy, the screen pans with the player, meaning the small platform is no longer visible, making for some frustrating landing. First-timers are likely to die many times, though using the rolling technique can ease the pain if one pulls it off. Finally, Big Ape City features Balloon Barrage. Really, the problem is trying to land on small platforms with the momentum-heavy jumping. Sliding off these tiny platforms or missing them completely is a frequent occurrence and represents another speed bump on the way to beating the game. However, I don't find myself bothered too much by these stages, and this makes me feel like a hypocrite. In other games, these types of difficulty spikes are a major turnoff and cause me to sour on a game. However, I didn't find myself annoyed with Donkey Kong Land. Perhaps this is because of the lives and saving system. The player is given the opportunity to save progress after each and every stage. In order to accomplish this, one must find the 4 Kong letters within each level. If found, upon completing a stage, the save screen is rewarded. While I tend to think 8-bit hard platformers should just automatically save after every stage, this is a fine solution as well. It encourages players to explore the levels fully, as well as force one to come to grips with the strange momentum, rather than ignore them and hope for the best. If one is actively seeking these out to earn the saves, they'll certainly have less trouble when those difficulty spikes arrive. The reward for finding Kong letters is worth the time it takes to acquire them. Second, DKL makes it easy to rack up an impressive life count. Those hearts at the bottom represent how many lives the player has, and even after it is full, lives continue to stack in the game's memory. As you'll notice in the video, after the first world, I never have fewer than 20 extra lives at any point in the adventure. On my initial practice run, I actually saw the game overscreen quite a bit. The game is tough. However, once I figured out the Kong coins, it was smooth sailing. These Kong coins appear useless at first. Collecting them doesn't seem to do anything obvious, and there is no HUD. They seem like random collectibles. However, they serve an important purpose. Some of the bonus areas are actually a mini-game where one can redeem the coins for a chance at extra lives. On this screen, one can now see the Kong coins are actually tallied. Whenever the player presses the button, the barrel at the top fires a coin. If collected, a 1-up is earned. While this isn't communicated clearly to the player, the ability to save after each stage and earn hundreds of lives eases the pain. The player is in control, and not at the mercy of in-game randomness. While I would prefer the stage design to always fit the unique jumping and limited screen from beginning to end, I think this is what makes the speed bumps more palatable in DKL. And of course, Donkey Kong Land does a lot of things brilliantly. First, most of the game does work within the limits of the controls in the screen. Enemies move at a reasonable speed, allowing players the appropriate time to react. The stage design works within the low resolution, meaning there are few leaps of faith. And if a platform is off screen, there is always a trail of bananas guiding the player to safety. Levels feel well crafted, like the designers did actually playtest everything, mostly, to confirm challenges were fair rather than trollish. Much like the 16-bit titles, Donkey Kong Land manages to capture and hold my attention through terrific level design. Now, I'm not one to complete games 100%, and when I do, it is often out of a sense of obligation rather than because I enjoy doing it. However, Rare's Donkey Kong efforts have proven to be the exception for me. Each stage contains between 0 and 3 bonus rooms. In order to achieve a 100% on a save file, players will need to seek out all 46 bonus areas on the game's 30 levels. These are often devilishly hidden, but usually there are hints for the player to spot. It could be a random banana where it isn't supposed to be, a barrel briefly visible on the screen, or sometimes off the beaten path, rewarding exploration. Even better is when the player needs to solve a simple puzzle. This TNT barrel is used to defeat a basket of snakes, which is blocking a tire jump that launches Kong to a bonus room. I love little touches like this. It seems simple, but these brief moments of discovery increase engagement. Another thing thing holding my attention is the variety. Some might call them gimmicks, but there are many different obstacles and hazards to traverse through, and DKL does a nice job keeping one on their toes. The snow is slippery, changing up the physics and forcing the player to deal with enemies in different ways. With slow acceleration and stomping, the player is required to do a better job anticipating enemy movement rather than simply reacting. Some jungle stages feature vines, with precision needed in order to jump off them correctly. A different vine requires the player to navigate up and down to avoid zingers. Pattern recognition moments go a long way to holding a player's attention. And of course, there are barrels. Many of these move and rotate, adding a timing element to the gameplay. Time things wrong and lose a life. Get it all right and one receives the sweet taste of victory. These concepts of pattern recognition and timing come to a crescendo in the third world, chimpanzee clouds. Track attack requires players to maneuver through hazards while on a small platform. Anticipation, pattern recognition, and timing are all necessary to navigate the obstacle course successfully. But as the concepts were slowly built up, track attack doesn't feel overwhelming. The aforementioned sky-high caper is similar. This should have been an awesome level. Precise timing is needed to force the platform to quickly change directions. Each leap or bounce off the environment cause it to change directions in a counterclockwise fashion. This forces precision from the player to manipulate the platform through the stage. Sadly, the full potential of the gimmick is never fully realized, and instead it ends up being frustrating. Being a mid-90s platformer, there are of course a handful of water stages, and like 90s water stages, these require the player to tap the jump button to ascend and press nothing to descend, or hold the down button to descend faster. While I prefer modern water stages with a full range of movement, these aren't the worst water stages I've ever played. The enemy patterns presented work within the confines of the small screen. This means simple or slow patterns, and I never had an instance of something surprising me from off-screen. Even better, the inconsistent hit detection actually works to the player's benefit, further reducing any tedium the stages might provide. Better yet, the water stages contain no bonus barrels, meaning players won't have to swim against every wall in stages looking for a hidden entrance to a hidden cave. Good stuff. While infrequent, water stages evolve as well. One stage features Nemo, who will chase the Kongs, forcing the player to keep moving or risk damage. The stage design works well with the chase, flowing perfectly horizontally and vertically, with just enough forgiveness to allow the player to determine which way to swim to elude the beast. I also dug this tornado enemy, Swirlwind. The player can only touch the top of it, which also serves as a spring of sorts. The tornado follows the player too, meaning the player can manipulate its behavior. Clever players will need to manipulate it to nab letters, as well as use one to reach a bonus area. I love this sort of thing, and it makes me feel clever when I solve the riddle the designers crafted. Speaking of riddles, there are movable tires. These don't do much at first, just move them across the screen to reach a high ledge. However, this does teach tires can be moved, and what their utility might be. Pothole Panic puts this to expert use, with players needing to move tires through a barrage of hazards in order to find all of the bonus areas. It is these moments that kept me glued to the screen and engaged for 3 full playthroughs, including 2 100% runs. While optional, I do find going for a 100% save file is where Donkey Kong Land truly shines. Still, this doesn't forgive the game's problems. The momentum should feel more consistent than erratic. The player shouldn't be launched off the screen and have to find a moving platform. Enemy placement should be tighter, allowing the player to bounce off enemies with more confidence. Perfect DKL is not. Moving on is the presentation. Like many Game Boy games of this era, there are a number of ways to experience it. When played on the original Game Boy or via download on the 3DS, players are stuck with a traditional monochromatic presentation. Alternatively, when played on a Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Player, tiles and sprites each receive a unique palette. This helps sprites stand out from the background, which is usually a good thing. For this review though, I am choosing to play on the Super Game Boy. The main reason is because of the Super Nintendo controller. The D-pad is far superior to that of the GameCube. I'm also fascinated by the Super Game Boy, and appreciate how many titles actually use custom color palettes when played in this fashion. As expected, Rare put the additional hardware to good use, with a wide array of color palettes greatly adding to the visual variety. As is obvious, the artists decided to stick with the pre-rendered 3D style, and the results are mixed. First, I applaud the designers for attempting to recreate 3D art with just 4 colors. However, I'm not here to reward bonus points for ambition, only execution. At times, the background tiles look more like pixelated art rather than pixel art, if that makes sense. The limited 4-color palette often makes environments look extremely contrasty, and the illusion of 3D depth is lost with the lack of subtlety and gradual gradients. Worse yet, whenever the designers attempted to recreate a dark environment, the Kong sprites tend to blend in. The Kongs both feature the darkest color predominantly, and when those shades are absent in the backgrounds, the Kongs stand out, allowing the eye to quickly process what is what. However, when the backgrounds utilize too much of this dark shade, sprites can be lost. I cannot blame the hardware for this. It is up to the artist to work within the confines of the medium, and sometimes they simply didn't. Still, these moments of unpleasantness are infrequent. Additionally, when actually playing Donkey Kong Land, I never had any issues tracking the protagonists. Still, it could have and should be better. On the flip side, the sprite work is excellent. I cannot recall another 8-bit title with such smooth animation. The Kongs look stunning while walking, running, jumping, rolling, and climbing. Additionally, the high contrast color palettes work with the characters, helping their features and limbs stand out against their bodies. Of course, their immense size does contribute to the screen crunch. Still, viewed on their own, the sprite work is impressive. Even more impressive is the lack of any slowdown. Perhaps I've overlooked it, but as best as I can tell, Donkey Kong Land hums along at a solid 60 frames per second, or 59.7, without a hiccup. The only technical hiccup I could find was some screen flicker when too many sprites are on the same line. Still, the designers seem to do a great job limiting the on-screen action to prevent slowdown while maintaining large and detailed sprites. Moving on, the soundtrack is mostly great. Now, I find myself generally enjoying the 8-bit music produced by both the NES and Game Boy hardware. I do not know why my ears find this specific era of music so pleasing. Perhaps it is nostalgia, but I do. And Donkey Kong Land sounds terrific to my ears. The most famous track, DK Island Swing, is of course present and accounted for, and sounds as delightful as ever. This is a testament to the excellent composition, which would seemingly sound great with any audio hardware. The intro slowly builds to the epic chorus, which continues to stay with me long after I put the cart down. The variety of tones and pitches elevate the track, and the reverb helps the piece feel full. If one is into the classic 8-bit sound, I cannot imagine DKL disappointing. Of course, the composers didn't just craft catchy tunes. Northern Hemispheres is ominous and depressive, with the slower melody and deep bass giving the constant feeling of dread and doom. Gangplank Galleon again shows off some range, with convincing drums and percussions giving an almost Civil War battle music vibe. I love the complexity of the track as well, starting off chipper and upbeat before evoking a sense of alarm and danger. Same as ever, this lengthy track shows off the range of the composers and surprisingly, a real comprehension of the audio hardware. Not every track is a winner though. The building site music is a bit noisy, which I assume is the intent of the track, but it ends up sounding harsh to my ears. As I lack the vocabulary and knowledge when it comes to music, I don't know how to explain it properly, but something about the notes or the pitches don't harmonize together correctly, creating an unpleasant sound when I listen to it. Much like the rest of Donkey Kong Land, the soundtrack is mostly good, with catchy melodies, atmospheric compositions, and a wide range of instrument sounds, but it occasionally stumbles. this is kind of a metaphor for the entire game. Donkey Kong Land is mostly good, but occasionally stumbles. Like many games, one's weight on these miscues will likely determine their overall feelings toward the adventure. Myself, I don't find myself troubled. The infinite continues assures players never lose much progress, with the Kong letters allowing players to save after each and every level, further reducing the frustration of a bad stage. Finally, the abundance of extra lives from collecting 100 bananas, hidden balloons, and the extremely generous Kong coin game. One will often be starting a level from a checkpoint and not the beginning. When I play DKL, I'm often reminded of the classic Castlevania games. Challenges are presented, usually fair but brutal, with a few cheat moments thrown in as well, but overcoming the challenges often results in a feeling of gratification, like something great has been achieved after overcoming adversity. Will every player experience this? Perhaps not. Maybe they'll just feel annoyed at what the developers created. While I don't find Donkey Kong Land to be a great game, I do find it to be good. With practice, one can develop a muscle memory for the physics, even the aggressive momentum. With a little memorization, challenges can be overcome. While I don't generally enjoy trial and error difficulty, it can work with a proper save, life, and checkpoint system, which Donkey Kong Land has. Lastly, I did occasionally feel like a button press wasn't resulting in an on-screen jump, causing death. However, I experienced this with most Game Boy games, so perhaps there is some limitation in the hardware which causes these presses not to register. I can't be certain. But more importantly than any of this is the level design. Donkey Kong Land is a well-crafted adventure. The designers did a magnificent job with the platform placement, creating a challenging adventure that rarely feels unfair. The hazards and obstacles challenge a player's pattern recognition skills along with their dexterity. This constant onslaught held my attention for multiple playthroughs, demanding my attentiveness at all times, punishing sloppy play, and offered a sense of accomplishment when adversity was overcome. Compared to some newer games I've recently played, this was a breath of fresh air for me, providing something I have been missing. Still, if I scored games, this would not be getting a 90% or 4 stars. Enjoying the game comes with a lot of caveats regarding difficulty spikes, a love for a specific type of music sound, and an appreciation for 2-bit color palettes. If one is making a lot of exceptions to excuse design elements, it is probably a sign the game isn't as great as one is proclaiming. Donkey Kong Land is a great example of an aging game. Where there was once glowing review scores and high praise is now divisiveness and a broader range of opinions. What was once acceptable may no longer be. The appeal is more limited than it once was. If you're a fan of difficult 8-bit games, Donkey Kong Land is sure to scratch a certain itch. If one would prefer games of this ilk remain in the past, then one might want to stay away. You know what I like about Donkey Kong Land 2? The protagonists move along the ropes faster. In the first game, the characters chugged along. In the sequel, they zip along, effortlessly gliding from rope to rope. It is a little change for sure, but in some ways it is a metaphor for the entire game. Donkey Kong Land 2 could have just reused the first engine, slapped some new sprites and tiles into the game, and called it a day. But that is not what Rare did. They learned what worked in DKL, scrapped what didn't work, and improved nearly every aspect of the title. The Donkey Kong Land games could have just been cash grabs to capitalize on the success of the 16-bit franchise, but no, Rare treated the handheld franchise with love, care, and respect. Much like the first game, Donkey Kong Land 2 retains the pre-rendered 3D look of the console games, despite the limited 2-bit color depth available with the hardware. Thankfully, the sprite and tile work has been massaged to better fit the limitations of the Game Boy. Backgrounds are greatly simplified, for example, allowing the Kongs and enemies to stand out. And when the backgrounds are detailed, they rarely use the darkest shade, again making sure sprites are distinguished. While the reduced color count of the tile set certainly diminishes the 3D effect, it is clear the developers identified a weakness of the first game and set out to improve the player experience. This can be seen in the sprite work too. Diddy and Dixie have outlines and feel more hand-drawn than 3D rendered. It is a step away from the series' roots, but again improves the fidelity of the sprites with the reduced resolution of the target platform. On the flip side, the team stuck too close to the console game instead of the target platform when it comes to saving. The first DK land was perfect. Find the 4 Kong letters and one could save their game. This meant a save was available after each and every stage. This works great for handheld games and is great for hard games generally. Donkey Kong Land 2 doesn't follow this philosophy. Instead, players can only save after opening up the Kong College of each world. For example, in the opening world, Gangplank Galleon, the player has to beat 3 levels before the opportunity to save is presented. Granted, the first 3 stages are relatively easy, but this doesn't make sense for a handheld game. The problem is exacerbated in the 4th world, Gloomy Gulch. Players will have to beat the boss of World 3, Ghostly Grove, Crazy Coaster, and Gusty Glade before being able to save again, and these stages are significantly more difficult. While I appreciate Rare attempting to replicate the console experience on diminutive hardware, I don't understand why changes were made in some areas, like background tiles, but not others, like the save system. Still, other improvements do exist. Bouncing off enemies is less erratic, with the momentum and inertia feeling less jarring and more subtle, giving players a better sense of control and confidence. Rolling into enemies will also increase the Kong's speed, although I never found myself wanting increased speed with the limited visibility. Still, between the snappier movement on the ropes and improved control when bouncing off enemies, Donkey Kong Land 2 feels even better than the first game, which was already pretty good. Like DKL, DKL 2 is similar to its console counterpart. For many, perhaps even a little too close. There are no unique set pieces found, and all are ripped straight from the console game. That means the ships, lava, mines, swamp, roller coaster, brambles, hives, ice, and castle set pieces will be familiar to veterans of the series. There are 2 ways to look at this. First would be disappointment, as there is nothing new to see here. In fact, DKL2 is often called a watered-down version of Donkey Kong Country 2, and therefore not worth playing. However, the level themes are still great. I mean, call me crazy, but these set pieces are still wildly imaginative, and the fact I've seen them before doesn't change that fact. Even better is how each offers unique challenges for players to overcome. The pirate-themed stages have the aforementioned ropes. Movement is limited to a grid, and players will have to pay attention to banana placement to avoid enemies, rather than just jump. Lava stages offer balloon rides, forcing players to react quickly to oncoming obstacles as the balloon slowly descends. The mines are packed with barrels, offering an alternate playstyle based on well-timed button presses. The swamp relies heavily on the idea of enemies as platforms, with the difficulty ramping up around halfway through the adventure. The hives have sticky walls and floors, further hampering players with restricted movement. The coasters again return, changing the gameplay from platforming to quick reactions on an auto-scrolling stage. As the game nears the home stretch, the player is challenged with brambles, stages relying heavily on a variety of different barrels, bottomless pits, and spiked ceilings and walls, punishing sloppy play with every mispress. There are haunted forests with disappearing vines, icy worlds with slippery floors, and castle areas with small platforms. At this point, reviewing the 7th game in the series, would I have appreciated something new visually? Sure, but at the same time, what is here is good. As hinted at, it isn't just the changing visuals which is nice, but rather how the set pieces alter the gameplay. Each level type asks something new from the player. The opening stages are simple. Pirate Panic eases players into the action. All of the enemies can be rolled into or jumped on. There are no bottomless pits, so players shouldn't die while familiarizing with the jumping mechanics and physics. The level secrets are reasonably easy to find, with the item placement hinting at their locations. After this, Donkey Kong Land 2 pulls no punches. Main Brace Mayhem features the ropes. Later, in Chain Link Chamber, zingers are added to increase the challenge. Squawk's Shaft has rotating barrels, allowing players to become familiar with them before the devilish bramble stages remove the margin for error. These concepts of showing a player something and expanding upon it later are littered throughout the adventure. Swamp levels have cattails, vertical vines to grab onto and jump off of. Similar obstacles are then found in Ghostly Grove, only now the vertical ropes disappear. All of these moments are expertly designed. Concepts are shown to the player is expected to learn them as they will be tested on their proficiency later on. The player learns how to jump over a zinger in a roller coaster on a bonus stage, where failure doesn't result in losing a life. The timing is specific and is good practice for when it counts later on. Variety isn't achieved just through unique set pieces and hazards. Donkey Kong Land 2 brings back 5 animal buddies from the console game. Rambi the Rhino is basically an indestructible beast, able to smash through all enemies and even bounce off spiked enemies like zingers. On Guard the Swordfish is a welcome addition as it increases the pacing of the water levels. Movement is no longer based on tapping the action button, but rather the Swordfish has full range of movement and melee attack. Good stuff. Ratley the Rattlesnake is an interesting buddy. Like Rambi, he can bounce off enemies, but his jumping changes how one tackles a stage. He can't hang off hooks, roll into enemies, or float through the air. So there is some balance here. His extra high jump, including the super jump charged with the select button, is used to reach many bonuses and secrets. It forces the player to think about the stages in a different way, as the verticality of the character is so different from the Kongs. Squawks the Parrot is basically a water level. Tap the button to ascend, stop to descend. Thankfully, his projectile attack has a generous hitbox that makes the levels feel fast and loose, rather than constricted and claustrophobic. There's also Quawks. This bird cannot fly or attack, only descend. It essentially turns Parrot Chute Panic into an auto-scrolling stage, where the player must react and maneuver around hazards. Lastly, there is Squitter the Spider. He is quite vulnerable to all enemies and cannot touch anything but clobbers. However, he can spit webs which can dispose of enemies from a safe distance. More importantly, he can create web platforms to traverse levels in alternate ways. And I have mixed feelings about this buddy. For one, using select to create platforms is awkward, as most players' muscle memory is to use their left thumb purely for movement. Having to move the left thumb over to the select button never felt normal or natural for me, even after a dozen hours of playtime. Second, certain areas offer little interactivity for the player. Just shoot, select, jump, over and over and over. Later, the player will have to deal with enemies, which is great progression, but the beginning areas are a bit dull. Anyway, while some might find the animal buddies gimmicky, I think they add variety to the gameplay. DKL2 is remarkably long for a Game Boy platformer, and the levels do a reasonable job of being designed around the unique capabilities of each one. This is the biggest compliment I can offer to Donkey Kong Land 2. I frequently talk about games wasting players' time, be it through bad hub world design, repeated level gimmicks, repeated story segments, poor level design, asinine puzzles, or even things like limited continues. Donkey Kong Land 2 doesn't waste the player's time at all. Despite its minuscule size, the developers packed a massive game into a small space, 39 stages and 7 boss fights, and they didn't resort to repeating stages to achieve this size. Speaking of bosses, these are massively improved over the first game. I glossed over these in the previous review, so let us take a quick look at why. Wild Sting Fling has the player jumping on a stingray as it swoops around the screen. Seabed Showdown has the player dodging an attack, so it could ricochet back into the boss. Mad Mole Holes has the player jumping onto a mole after it throws an axe. None of these require much strategy or dexterity, but none were frustrating or annoying either. King K. Rool was the only one featuring any sort of depth. He had 3 phases. First, where he threw his crown, which was then the vulnerability period. A second phase where the player dodged belly flop attacks, and a final phase where the crown throwing happened at a much faster pace. Not groundbreaking, but again, hardly offensive and a decent way to cap off the adventure. Donkey Kong Land 2 ups the boss game big time. Crow requires the player to jump over the boss, wait for the egg to stop moving, then pick it up so it can be used offensively. Cleaver requires the player to dodge attacks, use cannonballs to attack the boss, and then race to the other side of the map before the boss strikes. It is nice progression, adding a third task for the player to complete in order to be successful. The bosses become more suspect from here on out though. King Zing is easily the most difficult boss in the game. The player uses squawks to launch projectiles at the bosses behind. With each hit, the player must avoid the boss as it homes in on the player. In the second phase, King Zing will leave zingers strewn about the map, further hampering movement. The problem boils down to screen crunch. The boss is massive, and the player's visibility doesn't match the boss's patterns or the strategy to defeat it. My first playthrough was frustrating as I died repeatedly. Getting hit by a fast-moving boss I could not see coming. After a while, players will figure out the path the boss takes and should be able to find safe spots on the screen to avoid receiving touch damage. But this trial and error boss design is in stark contrast to the rest of the game design design, which is challenging but never cheap. This philosophy continues with Creepy Crow. For some inexplicable reason, there is a massive platform at the bottom of the screen serving little purpose than to further restrict the already cramped screen size. There is a distinct pattern to follow in both boss phases, but the challenge comes from trial and error, rather than testing the player's dexterity. To add insult to injury, players will be surprised with dropping eggs between the two phases. The entire fight feels unfair, and while I'm thankful the player can save the game before each and every fight, I didn't feel satisfaction upon victory, just bewilderment. King K. Rool, on the other hand, might almost be too easy. His projectiles don't move particularly fast, the patterns are simple, and there isn't much to it. It fails to be a test of a player's skill and doesn't function as spectacle either. I'll take this over being unfair and frustrating, but something about it feels underwhelming and anticlimactic. Of course, if one searches out all of the bonus rooms, collects all of the DK coins, and completes the Lost World stages, they will be treated with a final boss. This represents a vastly superior fight. The attacks are far more aggressive, demanding quick reflexes from the player in order to beat, and the difficulty greatly increased my satisfaction upon completion. While far from perfect, the boss encounters are a significant step up over the first DKL. The bosses in the first game were mostly forgettable, while the bosses in DKL 2 are anything but. However, there is room for improvement, a middle ground where the bosses work with the limited hardware without being overly frustrating. I'll be curious if the designers continue to improve the formula in Donkey Kong Land 3. Another thing that could use improvement is enemy placement. Screen crunch continues to be an issue in the game. Platform placement is great, with bananas guiding players to off-screen platforms and the game always giving visual cues on forward progression. It is specifically an enemy placement issue, where jumping onto an off-screen enemy is far more common than it should be. This was less annoying in the first title because saving was available after every level, but in Donkey Kong Land 2, there are stretches where saving isn't available, which conflicts with the game design. Dixie Kong is also somewhat broken too. First, I should note the general slipperiness of the physics. As best as I can tell, there were no changes made to the running momentum. Like the first game, I still slid off platforms to my death. Perhaps there were changes made to the programming, I can't be certain, but I didn't feel these changes in practice. Thankfully, Dixie Kong eases the pain. With her floating abilities, players always have the ability to gently land on a platform, alleviating this problem completely. While helpful, this comes with the side effect of nerfing some stages. The timing and precision crafted in Ghostly Grove are basically gone, as Dixie can safely hover over the obstacles almost completely. Same goes for Bramble Scramble. Precision jumps onto meticulously placed platforms no longer exist. Much of the game isn't impacted by Dixie's impressive moveset thanks to water levels, coaster levels, vertically focused stages, and of course a plethora of animal buddy areas, and thankfully she cannot hover after bouncing off an enemy, but sometimes she definitely feels overpowered and unbalanced. Lastly, and this is probably mostly subjective, but the game sometimes follows the console game too closely. Don't get me wrong, this is not a watered-down port of the Super Nintendo title. Level layouts are completely unique all across the board. Donkey Kong Land 2 is a different game than Donkey Kong Country 2, though once in a while I would get a feeling of deja vu. Rickety Race returns, requiring players to bounce off enemies to take them out of the race. Screech's Sprint pits Squawks in a race against Screech, mimicking the 16-bit level. Slime Climb has the player racing up a sinking ship. These are all fine levels, but at times I couldn't help shake that feeling I had been here before. Granted, if this is, or was, someone's first entry into the series, this would be moot, but I would have appreciated the developers trying something new, rather than rehashed gimmicks. Speaking of rehashed is the soundtrack. This is a positive. The soundtrack in Donkey Kong Land 2 just might be my favorite of any Game Boy title, rivaling the likes of Kirby's Dream Land and Super Mario Land 2. Disco Train is a fantastic piece, with the high-energy sounds matching the on-screen roller coaster action perfectly. The crunchy drum notes and high-pitched percussions give the intro and chorus a ton of depth, and there is something extremely appealing about the upbeat and peppy melody. Sticker Bush Symphony is also present. This is the opposite of Disco Train, with a somber, melancholy vibe. Again, the tone of the track matches the feeling feeling of the level, with danger looming all around the player. If one ever wondered what an 8-bit version of this iconic track would sound like, wonder no more. It remains an amazing composition, with instruments fading in and out with each verse, building and collapsing around the same 5-note hook that relentlessly loops through the entire piece. In a Snowbound Land is another stellar track, giving me rhythm and blues vibes. Over top a bed of deep bassy drums are high notes. They climb and build, contrasting beautifully with the oppressive drum lines. Again, I can't help but feel like the track fits the level theme beautifully, especially in Clapper's Cavern. The water damages the congs, the bass line, but Clapper can freeze the water, creating temporary reprieve, the high notes. However, there is one constant with every track. Sound effects frequently cut out a channel of the music. Sometimes it isn't noticeable at all, but other times it cuts out the focus of the particular piece at that particular moment, interrupting the track. It can be incredibly distracting and sometimes pulls me out of the experience. This problem isn't exclusive to DKL2, but I found the issue more prominent here than most other 8-bit titles. Some might not be bothered by it, others might find it maddening, but overall, I still find the soundtrack to be exceptional. Moody, atmospheric, catchy, somber, upbeat, and everything in between. Donkey Kong Land 2 has an incredible range of emotions on display, and I found the soundtrack delightful from beginning to end. Last but not least are those bonus rooms and DK coins. Per usual, I feel completing Donkey Kong Land 2 to be the best part of the experience and where the level design flexes its muscles. The game challenges the player to notice little design cues and explore them for possible bonus rooms. The bonus rooms must be completed this time, rather than just found, and challenges players to either just reach the end, defeat all enemies, or collect all of the stars within a time limit. While I'm not a completionist by any stretch, and I find 100%ing a game often reveals more flaws in a title than it reveals good design, Rare continually buck this trend with their Donkey Kong platformers. Finding all 47 bonus rooms rewards the player with 47 Creme coins, necessary to unlock 5 stages in the Lost World, each containing a hidden DK coin, with all 40 being necessary to take first place on the video game's hero end screen and finally earn a 100% on a save file. My only real complaint with the completion run is how the 5 stages in the Lost World aren't that difficult. Instead, Slime Climb is likely the most challenging stage in the game. Players need to move quickly up the level as the rising water harms the player. The stage is packed with dense enemy patterns and technical jumps and is sure to test a player's mettle on a first playthrough. Sadly, the Lost World never reaches this level of technical challenge, which I find somewhat disappointing. Still, as a whole, Donkey Kong Land 2 has a gentle difficulty curve. Each world represents a higher challenge than the last, keeping me engaged all the way to the end credits. While I wish the bosses were better matched to the hardware, learning their patterns and overcoming adversity was still a rewarding experience. And damn, are most of these levels excellent. There is sufficient variety to support the 5-hour campaign, both visually and mechanically. There are plenty of tough jumps to master, the timing of the barrels remains a great test of pattern recognition, the animal buddies greatly enhance the water stages, and each feels distinct, changing up the gameplay with new mechanics to learn and level design which matches the new abilities. Donkey Kong Land 2 represents a welcome improvement over the first game. The controls are smoother, the bosses are better, the graphics fit the color limitations better, there are fewer difficulty spikes, and while I wish the save system wasn't a step backwards, the game is otherwise superior in nearly every way. In short, Donkey Kong Land 2 is ridiculously good. Donkey Kong Land 3 was never released in Japan. Instead, a colorized version of the game titled Donkey Kong GB, Dinky Kong, and Dixie Kong was released on the Game Boy Color in 2001. I'm not sure if I should be more puzzled as to why Donkey Kong Land 3 was never released in Japan in its original Game Boy form, or why this colorized version of the title was never released in the West. It is weird for sure, but I'm thankful it exists. This colorized version greatly expands upon the visual visual presentation of the first 2 DKL titles. Sprites now have their own color palettes, meaning enemies, heroes, and items no longer share the same 4 colors. Same goes for the tile work, with different background tiles using different colors, greatly expanding the visual variety. This completely eliminates many graphical compromises from the past games. Character sprites no longer blend into the backgrounds, for example, and gradients in the 3D artwork are more subtle, with less high contrast areas looking out of place. Of course, one might question some of the color choices chosen by the artists. A few enemies are especially vibrant or garish. Perhaps this was a result of the original Game Boy Color screen, which lacked a backlight, or perhaps it was more deliberate. I can't be certain, but the days of enemies not standing out are definitely over. What remains consistent is the visual style. Donkey Kong Land 3 retains the pre-rendered 3D look defining the series. This means the world is filled with texture and depth, with semi-realistic shadows and reflections, offering a unique visual style that has all but vanished with the advent of fully polygonal graphics. Despite the low resolution of the hardware, it works. The various set pieces are easy to discern, be it the docks, mill, snow, river, coral, tree, cliffs, machine, falls, cave, jungle, or tubes. Each area of Donkey Kong Land 3 does an admirable job implementing the 3D assets into the resolution and color limitations of the platform. Also remaining admirable is the animation. Both Diddy and Dixie move with a fluidity rarely seen on 8-bit hardware. The walking, running, and jumping animation frames are excellent, with all of their limbs moving in harmony while their faces shift side to side. I continue to be amazed at what the artists were able to achieve, with the animation cycles easily surpassing most games released on superior hardware. Of course, Donkey Kong Land 3 marks the return of Kiddy Kong, the most hated Kong in Donkey Kong history. Seriously, something about this character bothers some to their core. There are 2 schools of thought. The first is a sort of opportunity cost. With Kiddy Kong on the roster, there was no room for the return of Donkey Kong. For others, the fact there is a baby in the game cheapens the spirit of the series. Be it the Super Nintendo games, the Retro Studios titles, or the Game Boy spin-offs, the franchise has always been in the upper echelon of challenge and difficulty. For some, the introduction of a baby clashes with what the series was built upon. The only other video game character which can draw such ire is the Werehog from Sonic Unleashed. Myself, for better or worse, I don't care. That isn't to say I don't respect people's opinions on the subject, but having never played the series prior to 2018, the character designs have no particular meaning for me. Kiddy Kong has been there for me since the beginning, and I just sort of accept him as part of the DK crew. Anyway, as best as I can tell, Dixie and Kiddy share the same momentum, acceleration, and jump arcs, meaning despite their noticeable size difference, their base moveset is identical. This is a good thing, as the Kongs remain some of the most nimble, responsive, and satisfying characters to control in all of 2D gaming. Acceleration is near instant, which is especially helpful for reacting to obstacles on the truncated screen. The jumping is also excellent, with the perfect amount of hang time. The jumping feels neither floaty nor stiff, and instead weighty but predictable. Seriously, the level of refinement in both 2 and 3 is exceptional, rivaling just about any 8-bit title not named Mario. Of course, the 2 Kongs are not the only characters one commandeers during the adventure. On Guard the Swordfish returns and is available in the underwater areas. Per usual, he has a free range of motion, eliminating the button tapping when the Kongs are swimming solo. Squawks the Parrot also returns, with the button pressing flapping, and a projectile, along with Squitter the Spider, who can shoot webs as an attack or use them to make platforms. Finally, there is newcomer Ellie the Elephant, who can attack with a water shot which can be aimed forward, high, and low. Sadly, I can't help but feel like the 4 animal buddies are underutilized. For example, On Guard has a dash attack, however, little in the levels requires this attack. The DK coins and bonus barrels are readily available without it. It isn't until the boss fight against Barbos that the buddy is utilized to its full potential. In fact, the water stages mark a significant downgrade limited compared to Donkey Kong Land 2. DKL2 varies up the water stages. Clapper the Seal will cool boiling water, but the effect is temporary, meaning the player has to race through the water obstacle and escape before being boiled. Another water area features light barrels, which light up the level. Again, the player is tasked with racing through the level so they aren't left stranded in the dark. Both do a reasonable job changing up the water stages so they don't become stale. Even the first Donkey Kong Land had a few chase sequences, again varying up the gameplay. Donkey Kong Land 3 lacks any sort of gimmick for the water stages. The lack of any speed challenges or unique enemies definitely make On Guard feel more like a nicety rather than something integrated into the level design. Squidder the Spider fares a little better. It is initially introduced as an optional buddy, not needed for a 103% completion, but rather a way to score an extra life. Later on in the adventure, the skills learned earlier become required to complete a save file. Maybe this is how I should view On Guard. The player learns the techniques in the levels before being tested on a boss fight. Anyway, Squawks is similar. In DKL2, it felt like the levels were designed with the bird in mind, with passageways not traversable with a normal Kong. However, in DKL3, the implementation feels shoehorned in. Ellie is even worse, with the character stripped down considerably from the console game with just a projectile attack. It begs the question on when something is a gimmick versus part of the game design. In Donkey Kong Land 3, the animal buddies feel like afterthoughts, something put into the game for legacy's sake. While I appreciate the occasional break in the action, gameplay variety can be a good thing. It feels lacking when compared to the variety in previous titles. Just note, these are not bad, with perfectly acceptable controls, responsive attacks, and accurate hitboxes. Also clumsy is the level design. With each playthrough, I found myself somewhat bored. I then had to ask myself if there is something wrong with the game or something wrong with me. After all, this is the 8th time I'm reviewing a game from the franchise. However, as I inspect the levels, I can't help but feel the development team took their foot off the gas. Without a doubt, Donkey Kong Land 3 is the easiest game in the series. The reason why is because it is remarkably hard to fall to one's death. DKL3 just doesn't feature many bottomless pits. It isn't until the halfway mark where the game finally picks up steam and punishes players for sloppy jumping. This isn't me speaking as an elitist who hates easy games. I love the Kirby franchise, for example, and Kirby is one of the most overpowered characters in all of gaming. It has more to do with engagement. With the animal buddies not offering sufficient engagement opportunities for players, extra pressure is put on the level design, and I feel DKL3 takes far too long to get up to speed. The lack of punishment for sloppy play makes the first half of the game feel unsatisfactory. There is one exception to this rule, however. There are 2 toboggan levels, and wow, these stages are fast. These effectively act like minecart stages with a different aesthetic, but man, does the screen zip by fast, notably faster than the previous Land games. The reaction times required are almost inhuman, turning the breezy gameplay into a trial and error fest. It is not clear to me why this gimmick in particular had its difficulty dialed up a few notches, while the platforming challenge decreased. It is not a decision for sure, and the toboggan stages felt out of place during the course of the adventure. Also out of place is collecting the DK coins. In non-water levels, DK coins are obtained by taking down a coin. Coin carries a shield, which will always face a Kong. Therefore, the player must ricochet a steel barrel to take him down. Sadly, the implementation is poor in 2 ways. First, Coin is easy to find. In fact, I found him on my first try in every level he is featured. Worse yet, there is little strategy to take him down, with the same motion being successful in nearly every instance. There was just 1 or 2 times where I would have to use an alternate strategy to take him down. It is disappointing for sure, and like the animal buddies, the concept doesn't feel like it was used to its full potential, which is a shame. On the opposite end of the spectrum are the bonus barrels. Again, I find seeking these out to be one of the high points of the game. I'm not a completionist, but I do like how the developers used little visual clues to hint at potential barrels, or required a little exploration to find. I especially loved having to bounce off a barrel shot by a bazooka. It is a great test of skill for the player to understand the timing of the projectile and then bounce off into a cleverly hidden barrel. However, a few bonus barrels are hidden in incredibly obtuse ways. Perhaps I was too positive in the hiding locations of previous games and am now just running out of steam, but a few of these are just absurd. Miller Instinct contains no clues whatsoever. The player just has to know to jump into a blank space on the screen. Redwood Rampage offers a similar conundrum. The barrel is not visible and is easy to miss. The worst has to be in Whiplash Dash, which requires the player to jump into an invisible barrel next to a bonus barrel, which is a concept never hinted at in the entire game. Donkey Kong Land 3 suffers from difficulty balancing Whiplash, where the game is either rather easy or insanely difficult or unfair, with little happening between these extremes. Anyway, this level is in the Lost World, which happens after the final credits, so let us back up a bit and talk about the bosses. The bosses in the first game were often too easy, lacking any challenge and failing to be spectacles. Donkey Kong Land 2 was a bit better, with some great bosses and some awful bosses not working within the confines of the screen. Donkey Kong Land 3 doesn't mark an improvement. The bosses follow a similar formula of the previous title. Once the boss pattern is learned, there is little challenge to be found. As the boss does not change or react to the player, little skill is required. Barbos Bastion has safe spots on the screen where the projectile attack cannot reach. Bleak Magic has the player dodging snowballs, but the safe spot on the roof, in addition to an easy pattern, makes this fight rather breezy once one becomes familiar with it. Eric is a little better. The projectile attacks require anticipation, as multiple are fired at once. Once cleared, the player needs to jump on the spider to damage it, then avoid the bounce attack. While still easy once the player knows the pattern, the multiple projectiles with no safe spot on the screen is nice progression. Crazy Chaos isn't so bad either. The attacks are easy to dodge, especially with Dixie and her hovering, but the timing window on the jump to actually do damage is small, and finally puts the incredible tight controls to good use. The final boss is alright, with quick reactions needed from the player to dodge lightning attacks and bounce attack, but all in all, it isn't the cherry on the top of an epic adventure, nor is it a particularly awesome visual spectacle. And just as a frame of reference of what is possible on the Game Boy, here is the final boss from Metroid 2. It is a massive beast filling the screen and requires some twitchy fingers in order to defeat. It works as both a final test of player skill and a visual spectacle, and is vastly superior to anything found in the Donkey Kong Land trilogy. Anyway, defeating K. Rool brings the adventure to a close and the credits roll. Of course, this is not the end of the adventure. To unlock the final area, Lost World, the player needs to collect all 35 DK coins available at this point, as well as the 5 stopwatches. The 5 stopwatches and 5 of the DK coins are actually collected from a matching minigame. A player has to quickly match 10 pairs while the timer races down at the bottom of the screen. Even better, the timer moves quicker with each passing level, increasing the challenge. Anyway, completing the matching game is required to unlock the Lost World and continue on towards completion. These final 6 levels are arguably more challenging than the normal levels, but if I'm honest, none of them are all that memorable. There is no animal antics or other iconic level, just more of the same. Still, it leads to the final boss, K. Rool's Last Stand. This expands upon the previous battle with new projectile attacks and a charge attack, demanding more dexterity from the player. However, the greatest contribution is the pits on either side of the screen. This little wrinkle demands just that extra bit of attention from the player, as a mistimed jump will send players to an instant death. In hindsight, I think this one little detail could have greatly increased other fights in the trilogy, helping push some of them over the top. Alas, it wasn't meant to be. To my surprise, this final fight is not the end of Donkey Kong Land 3. Once a player finds all of the bonus barrels in the Lost World and in the regular levels, they should amass a total of 77 bonus coins, which will unlock the final matching game, rewarding the final stopwatch and something I did not expect at all: a time attack mode. Yeah, somehow I've watched nearly 15 years of online video and had no idea this little gem was hiding at the end of Donkey Kong Land 3. Basically, it represents the final 6% of a save file, bringing the total to 103%, the only land game to surpass 100. Honestly, despite having no particular interest in speedrunning, I rather enjoyed all 12 of these trials. The challenge I often found lacking is cranked to 11 here. A player needs to memorize each and every level, knowing the precise location of each platform and enemy, in addition to any barrel shortcuts some levels may provide. Even better, little nuances from the controls come into play as well. For example, after rolling or a spinning attack, the Kongs briefly stop. However, if a player jumps before the stop, they can retain their momentum and continue forward. The water stage is especially brutal, as the Kongs can increase forward momentum by holding the speed button and down or jump, but not a normal forward swim. The player is forced to carefully manipulate the Kongs and on guard, using every nuance the game mechanics provide to be successful. Of course, while incredibly challenging, none of the 12 stages is impossible, with some allowing more slop than one might expect. I am frequently told I suck at games, and my lack of skill is what causes me to complain about certain difficulty spikes found in games, so perhaps these are easier than I am leading on. However, I did feel like these stages were some of the few moments where precision jumping, quick reactions, and skillful play were required for the player to be successful. And as I look back at Donkey Kong Land 3, I desperately wish the back half of the game offered more of these moments. While this review has been mostly negative, and I am keenly aware many consider this title to be the best of the trilogy, my negativity is more a byproduct of covering the positive aspects of the trilogy already. As best as I can tell, the controls are exactly as they were in the second game, which is to say, they're sublime, supremely responsive, with the awesome acceleration giving players exactly what they need to deal with the enemies and limited screen resolution. The jumping is some of the best I've ever experienced in the 8-bit realm, with excellent mid-air maneuverability. Slowing inertia mid-air feels amazing, and I feel bad for the 8-bit handheld title I'm reviewing next, because it doesn't even come close to the level of tightness on display here. Do I wish the platforming was a bit more technical? Sure. Enemy patterns can be far too simplistic, and DKL3 rarely tests a player's mettle. Difficulty comes at the player in strange bursts, and of course, the time attack challenge at the end. The Animal Buddy implementation is also the worst in the franchise. Still, despite these critiques, I still find the game to be exceptionally playable, and definitely better than most 8-bit platformers. The soundtrack remains amazing. Waterworld, Rockface Rumble, and Jungle Jitter stood out to me, representing some more fantastic 8-bit chiptunes. Much like the controls and overall presentation, I don't have much new to say about the soundtrack. The quality remains exceptionally high, and I can't imagine anyone not enjoying it. So here we are. While I don't find Donkey Kong Land 3 to be the best game in the series or even the Land trilogy, it is still a good game. The presentation is excellent, with no slowdown, little flicker, and features the best visual pop in the trilogy thanks to this Game Boy Color port. While I wish certain gameplay elements were better, like bonus barrel placement and Animal Buddy usage, neither of these are enough to bring down the experience as a whole. More impressive, this is the 8th title in the Donkey Kong Country franchise I have reviewed, and while I should be feeling fatigued at this point, I don't. DKL3 held my attention from beginning to end twice. That is rather amazing. Few other franchises have been able to retain such a ridiculous quality standard. If you are like me and can't get enough of the superb gameplay the franchise provides and are looking for some new levels to play, Donkey Kong Land 3 will most definitely satisfy.